Chapter 190. If Wenguan Peak was the core of the Inner Sword sect, then the core of the Outer Sword sect was the Thousand Virtues Peak. Regardless of whether it was the Sword Chi Soaring Heaven Pavilion, the Ascension Hall, or the Boa Tower, especially the latter two, they were the places most frequently visited by Foundation establishment cultivators. One could imagine what a university library with over 20,000 university students was like. The key point was that there were basically no people here who were just idling around. No one would assign you a job, and no one would guarantee your safety. Whether you could stand out or not depended entirely on your own self-awareness. The Boa Tower was located on the secondary peak of the Thousand Virtues Peak. It was not a single tower, but a cluster of buildings. Otherwise, it would not be able to satisfy the daily needs of over 20,000 people. Even in the cultivation world, if thousands of people entered and exited a single building at the same time, it would cause a lot of trouble for the manager. Fan Tower is isolated. Boa Tower is filled with 9 mysteries. Of the 9 buildings on the secondary peak of the Thousand Virtues Peak, the most books are over 10,000, and the least are over 3,000. They are all in the category of middle and low-level disciples. Apart from the Jindan stage ones that you can't look at, most of the others are in the category of Foundation establishment. You are qualified to have any of them. There are no restrictions, no conditions, and no price. Gu Bei sighed as he looked at the 9 buildings in front of him. A sense of pride welled up in his heart. This is Xianyuan. This is the greatest benefit. This is the reason why the cultivators outside are crying and shouting to join. Someone once estimated that even if you skimmed through all the books here, it would take at least 10 years, just like reading a historical biography. It's easy to imagine how many scrolls there are here, and how wide the scope is. This is a famous library in the 5th ring. Lu Xiaoyi keenly understood the meaning behind his words. Senior Martial Brother means that in the 5 rings, there are even more books than Xianyuan. Gu Bei knew that he had misspoken. He curled his lips and said disdainfully, "And we can barely be ranked in the top 10 in the 5 rings. In front of us are Supreme, 3 Pure Ones, Garen, Myriad Scenery, Chimendunjia, and so on. They have even more books. I heard that Supreme and 3 Pure Ones have more than 10 million books in their libraries, but you don't know, those books are just there to make up the numbers. Only a small number of books are used to make up the numbers. So what if they have a lot of books? If a fight really breaks out, won't they just bow their heads obediently?" Lu Xiaoyi had long since gotten used to Gu Bei stepping on and praising him. This Gu Bei was hopeless. It was as if Xianyuan was the center of the 5 rings and the center of the universe. For low-level cultivators, it might not be a problem, but for high-level cultivators to be so arrogant, it might not be a good thing. If everyone in Xianyuan thought so, then it meant that this sect was going through a period of glory, but it also meant that after the glory, there would be an inevitable decline. But he would not refute. Everyone had the right to love, and it was obvious that Gu Bei was supported by this love. "Senior brother, there has to be an index, right? He couldn't just blindly search through the books one by one, right? Actually, I feel that things like martial arts and sword arts are more important for quality than quantity. If there are too many, it will make it difficult for one to make a choice. If one's willpower is slightly weaker, wouldn't it be like a bear choosing a stick?" Gu Bei smiled. "At least you have some knowledge." He even knew that cultivators should abstain from greed. However, even though there are close to 100,000 books here and you can choose from every book, the sect has a limit on the number of books you can choose. With your current status as a new disciple, the limit is 1 martial art book, 3 sword arts books, and 5 other books. Every 10 years, there will be another 3 chances. When you reach 100 years old, the restrictions will be completely lifted. However, when cultivators reach that age, they all understand the fact that quantity cannot replace quality. Thus, no one will choose more. Looking at the 9 tall buildings in front of him, Lu Xiaoyi was still a little excited. Gu Bei probably wasn't bragging. No matter what, he would soon be free of the awkwardness of being a cultivator who couldn't cultivate. "Senior brother, which building are we going to? I want to choose a martial art book first." Do you have any recommendations? The kind that has quick effects, hurts when hit, and can increase one's power even when sleeping? Once they were familiar with each other, senior brother Gu Bei was a practical person. Don't be anxious, don't be anxious. We're already here, what's there to be anxious about? This place is open day and night, so there's plenty of time. However, there are some things that I must explain to you in advance so that you won't waste time. The two of them were very relaxed now because they had overcome a crisis and were finally back in a rhythm that they could control. It was not like the awkward situation when they were facing a nascent soul true lord where their lives were in the hands of others. Gu Bei explained. Of the 9 tall buildings, the first one is called Heaven's AO Tower. It specializes in storing martial arts books. There are more than 5,000 martial arts books, including 23 Great Tao martial arts books. There are more than 400 martial arts books that are derived from Great Tao martial arts books. The rest are self-created by Xianyuan swordsmen, or obtained from other places. Lu Xiao laughed. I was wondering why there were so many. So there were only 23 that were self-created. The other 400 were copied from Lingma, and the rest were simply snatched from all over the universe. These words were very sarcastic, but it was basically the truth. However, in the cultivation world, was snatching martial arts books considered snatching? If they were only counted as self-created martial arts books, Xianyuan probably wouldn't even have a single one left. It was probably the same for the other sects. A large collection of martial arts books in the world. Seeing that Gu Bei didn't say anything, Lu Xiaoyi also knew that this joke was a little too much. Senior apprentice brother, what you mean is that Xianyuan disciples only have 23 martial arts books to choose from, and the rest are just for reference. When their cultivation deepens in the future, or when they encounter some difficult problem, or when they need to cooperate with a certain sword technique, they can learn the rest. Gu Bei sighed. This kid was very talented and smart. With just a few words, he understood a principle that many people couldn't understand even after a few years. Exactly. Actually, there are less than 23. Among them, there are a few that can be used with both inner and outer swords. There are 17 that are completely suitable for outer swords. All of them lead directly to Great Tao, and all of them have their own systems. In other words, after you form your core, there will be a follow-up. After Yuanying, there will be further study, and all the way up until the entire system is complete and complete. There won't be any detours, and it won't be a waste of time. This is the foundation of a large sect. If it were a small sect, they wouldn't know when their next meal would be after this meal. It would be a waste of time to adjust and find ways to change. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Then what about the other books? Gu Bei continued. The second tower is called the Sword Turtle Tower. As the name suggests, it's where sword techniques are stored. It's also the tower with the most collection out of the 9 towers. There are more than 12,000 types of sword techniques here. Among them, there are more than 1,000 that have been passed down from our sect's tradition. There are more than 7,000 that have been refined and improved by the various seniors during their cultivation. There are also more than 3,000 that have been collected from all over the world. These sword techniques are different from cultivation techniques. Often, they're more powerful after being improved. After all, there are countless swordsmen in Xianyuan, and all of them are extremely talented. Who doesn't have 1 or 2 unique skills? If they're presented in the Sword Turtle Tower, they'll also be able to leave a name for themselves in the swordsman legacy. They can't be changed randomly. They have to go through actual combat and the test of time. Every sword technique has been thoroughly refined, and they strive for perfection. It's the same for the sword techniques collected from outside. If they're not of sufficient quality or power, they won't be able to enter. Therefore, among the 9 towers of Bo Ao, the Sword Turtle Tower is the best. You won't be able to find a more profound and extensive collection of sword techniques in the 5th ring. Chapter 191. Lu Xiaoyi believed in this point. There were countless ways to cultivate, and it was impossible for a sect to be the best in every aspect. There were always strengths and weaknesses. For Xianyuan, swordsmanship was his main strength, but he didn't know what else he was good at. Gu Bei continued. The third tower is called Feng Ao Tower. Swordsman's strength lies in swordsmanship and escape techniques. Feng Ao Tower is the escape technique tower. It has more than 3,000 escape techniques and is one of the best in the fifth ring. Especially in the various escape techniques of swordsmanship, it is unparalleled and can be ranked in the top 3. It is on par with the Qimen Duanjia. Speed and swordsmanship? Yes, a very practical combination. Lu Xiaoyi had experienced this himself. He had done this when he faced off against the Red Line Alliance in the Gobi Desert. The fourth tower is called Mountain Ao Tower. It is the direction of strengthening one's body. You can also see it as a classification of body cultivators. Of course, we don't put too much emphasis on it. When we emphasize on strengthening one's body, we place more emphasis on speed. This is actually a bit contradictory. It all depends on the cultivator's choice. Do you want to be more resistant? Or do you want to run faster? The fifth tower is called Cloud Ao Tower. It is a supplement. A cultivator's cultivation must be supported by spells. The sword is a weapon for killing and fighting, but cultivation is not only about fighting. There are many other things. Even fighting includes many other practical aspects, such as perception, stealth, concealment, and so on. It is a necessity for a well-rounded swordsman. There are also alchemy, array, talisman, medicine, divination, and so on. These are all paths that can be achieved independently. Xianyuan does not have much knowledge in these areas. He belongs to the lower middle level in the entire fifth ring. But we still provide the most basic skills to satisfy everyone's preferences. The sixth building was the Vast Turtle Building, which was a building for miscellaneous studies. It was about the universe, the 5 rings, Zhuozhou, as well as the 5 rings' 10,000 years of history, people, biographies, history, geography, culture, and everything else. It had a collection of over 1 million books. They were real books and not cultivation techniques. A cultivator in the process of growth was bound to come into contact with these things. It was better to read books than to enter closed-door cultivation. A cultivator's own knowledge, insight, and knowledge would be greatly improved. You couldn't travel through the entire universe, but you could at least understand this world and this universe through the eyes of countless seniors. So, even though it's a miscellaneous subject, it's actually a compulsory one. It just depends on which aspect you like. Lu Xiaoyi sighed in amazement as he listened. He, who was born in a small place, had slowly begun to accept Su Anyuan's strength. He no longer rolled his eyes at him because he was forced to come here. A small ant looking down on a giant dragon was also a strange mentality. However, in the past few days, he had finally straightened out his mentality. This was due to the stimulation from the sword pill incident, Su Anyuan's unquestionable strength, and Gu Bei's serious guidance. Some people were powerful in cultivation, but they couldn't become a teacher. Some people could become a teacher, but they couldn't make any progress in cultivation. Gu Bei was probably the latter. It was his luck to have met Gu Bei. He couldn't assume that just because he was a guide instructed by a sect, that everyone could do this. Lu Xiaoyi understood this in his heart, but he didn't have anything to repay Gu Bei. Therefore, he didn't say anything. Some things were clear in one's heart. It was enough to find an opportunity to do it. There was no need to talk about it all the time. He wasn't such a person. The 7th tower, Fighting Ao Tower. The books on the first floor are a type of book. They contain the characteristics of the cultivation techniques of the various sects in the 5th ring, their mystic arts, secret arts, powerful figures, and organization structures. It's not just about the 5th ring, but also about the star fields they passed through in the past 10,000 years. It also includes those between orthodoxies, such as the sword vein and other branches of Taoism, the orthodox, as well as Buddhism and other special orthodoxies, such as body cultivators, soul cultivators, ghostly cultivators, and so on. The purpose of this is to know yourself and know your enemy. When you go out and meet with other sects and factions, you have a basic understanding of your opponent. It's not like you're blind. Understanding your opponent in battle isn't beneficial to a swordsman's performance. The 8th Tower, Fighting AO Tower. Just from the name, you can tell that everything here belongs to Jean Dan. Foundation establishment cultivators don't have the right to go up there. The 9th Tower, Fighting AO Tower. It's mysterious and unknown. Anyway, I don't know about it. I've never entered it before. If you want to know, you'll have to work hard yourself. Lu Xiaoyi felt like his head was about to explode. As a person who was used to eating vegetables and tofu for a meal, how was he supposed to choose when faced with tens of thousands of delicacies, including those that flew in the sky, swam in the water, crawled on the ground? He hadn't even entered the tower yet, but he was already stunned. Gu Bei smiled proudly. In his career as a guide, most of the people who joined Xianyuan because they admired him. Most of them were natives from Zhuozhou and the Fifth Ring. They understood Xuanyuan's strength and knew about Xuanyuan's deeds, so there was no need to say much. They were very devout. However, there were also those who were unconvinced. There were all kinds of birds in the forest. They were clearly sh*t, but they looked down on the tall buildings. They basically came from the Fifth Ring's continuous battles in the universe. They used all kinds of tricks and robberies. In fact, they were sold as slaves. One could imagine how much resistance they had in their hearts. Even if they appeared to be well-behaved and docile, almost everyone had a rebellious heart buried in their hearts. When I grow up and become an immortal, I'll deal with the Fifth Ring's group of bandits. This was the innate nature of humans. They didn't see the Fifth Ring in Xuanyuan's strength and throw themselves at him and call him daddy. Humans were the most rebellious race, especially cultivators. They also used this kind of thinking as a motivation to move forward. However, time would change everything. When they truly grew up, they would discover that what they had gained in Xianyuan was far more than what they had lost in the beginning. And cultivation was a profession that didn't pay attention to one's background. When cultivators grew up, they learned to weigh gains and losses. They didn't consider problems based on the likes and dislikes of their youth. Their thoughts were swayed. In addition to Xuanyuan's unique charm of a sect, their initial resistance would become weaker and weaker, until they completely disappeared and became a true Xianyuan person. This was what guides like them had to do, although what they did was only the beginning of this long process. For example, right now, this kid was dumbstruck in front of Xuanyuan's gradually revealed strength. This was a kind of fundamental change, a kind of gradual acceptance of Xuanyuan's changes. He knew that this kid was far from being loyal to Xianyuan right now, but he also knew that if this kid could continue walking down this path, he would definitely become a loyal guard of Xianyuan like him. This was the significance of being a guide. It was hard work, but it was also enjoyment. The seeds he planted now would one day grow into a towering tree, even if he might not be able to see it. This was his belief. He relied on this to live, and he obtained great satisfaction from it. Chapter 192. I know you are confused now. As someone who has been through this, I will give you some advice at the first pavilion, the Heaven's AO Technique Pavilion. That is all. You can only choose for the rest. Whether it is right or wrong, it is actually a part of cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Cultivation techniques were the foundation of a cultivator's cultivation. Without this, everything was in vain. The 23 techniques of the Heaven's AO sect are actually born out of the 7 supreme Great Tao techniques. Not only the outer sword, but the techniques of the inner sword Fanlu are also the same. If you are lucky enough to cultivate all the way up, in the end, everyone will be reunited on these 7 supreme Great Tao techniques. This is the system. As for which 7 I won't say. It will only confuse you. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi's expression, he added, Well, I actually don't have access to these either. However, I have heard of them in the Foundation establishment realm. Cigarette, but don't laugh. If you laugh again, I will beat you up. Lu Xiaoyi tried his best to hold back his laughter. Senior brother Gu Bei was a kind person. He was just used to bragging and trampling on others. You could have just said that it was a foundation establishment technique. Why did you have to talk about the supreme great Tao techniques? You don't even know about it. You are embarrassed. Who can you blame? Gu Bei quickly regained his composure. The difference between the inner and outer swords is never in terms of techniques, but in terms of swordsmanship. Actually, it is not in terms of swordsmanship, but in terms of the medium. The sharpness of the sword ball is incomparable to our outer sword's flying sword. Therefore, with the same cultivation and the same swordsmanship, our outer sword is different from the inner sword. The difference cannot be made up. When the two of them were familiar with each other, Gu Bei did not hide the disadvantages of the outer sword. They would know about it sooner or later. Since this kid had entered the outer sword lineage, there was no need to hide it. However, the origins of the techniques are all the same. Among the 23 techniques, 6 can be used both inner and outer swords. 17 are exclusive to the outer sword. Don't underestimate the differences. The inner sword uses force on the Naiwen, while the outer sword uses force on the entire body. Each has its own emphasis. The total amount of magic power and spirit is there. It is impossible to take care of all aspects. If you take care of the Naiwen, you will damage the entire body. So, the outer sword lineage is chosen from the 17 techniques. This was the right path. Even if you have the chance to fuse with the sword pellet in the future, you can just cultivate the inner sword technique. You can't do both at the same time. Since you want to take care of one side, you don't want to give up the other. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Are there any differences between these two methods of exerting force? Gu Bei sighed. The difference is huge. The sword pellet was stored in a cultivator's mud pill palace. Every day, it was immersed with the spirit. It could be said to be an extension of the arm and the continuation of the consciousness. Therefore, when the inner sword was released, it was innately superior to the outer sword in terms of control. On top of that, the inner sword was not afraid of being damaged, contaminated, or stained with filth. He could use it as he wished without any scruples. External swords were different. One had to consider the environment in which the flying sword was used, whether or not the flying sword was seized by the opponent, whether or not it was bound, contaminated, damaged. How many swords could the sword case contain? How many swords could a cultivator refine in their lifetime? A single sword strike could be of high quality, but the quantity would be limited. He pursued quantity, but he could improve the quality of his flying swords. He couldn't have both. Unlike the inner sword pellet, it shrank in the mud pill palace and never came out. Therefore, the flying swords it released were endless and their might was still at its peak. Comparing the two, the lineage of the outer sword was at a huge disadvantage. The two had unknowingly digressed from the topic, but neither of them cared. It had been like this for the past few days, talking about whatever came to mind. Does the outer sword have no advantage at all? Gu Bei gave a wry smile. Of course, there are areas where the inner sword can't compare. For example, the range of the outer sword is further than the inner sword. The sword beam of the inner sword was formless and formless, so it would definitely be damaged in the process of flying. The further it flew, the weaker it would be. Therefore, it had the greatest effective range. The outer sword was different. In theory, as long as you could control it, the flying sword could fly forever. A flying sword could kill enemies hundreds of kilometers away. That was the ideal state of the outer sword. However, it was difficult to control it. It was useless if the consciousness couldn't keep up. Therefore, the advantage of the outer sword was limited by the consciousness, so it only existed in theory. In practice, regardless of whether it was the effective range of the inner or outer sword, it was within the range of the consciousness. Therefore, there was no difference in strength. Another reason why the outer sword was better than the inner sword was that the outer sword was stronger than the inner sword. The sword was heavy. The force was overwhelming. Moreover, this advantage could be continuously expanded by refining restrictions. However, the more restrictions there were, the less nimble it would be. When a cultivator reached the Jin Dan realm, their consciousness would explode and they would be able to split the sword beam. Then, the awkwardness would come. The more restrictions there were, the harder it would be to split them. It would be like a piece of ordinary iron that could instantly split into thousands of sword beams. On the path of cultivation, there are obstacles everywhere. If you take care of one, you will lose the other. A cultivator's cultivation is like walking on a tightrope. The most important problem is how to balance it. This is something that only each person can grasp. The seniors can only give a rough idea. As for the specifics, you can only figure it out yourself. Lu Xiaoyi humbly listened to the advice, but did not speak in human language. He was really treating his senior brother as one of his own. Senior brother, you digressed again. If you continue talking like this, the topic will be diverted. I'm afraid that I won't even be able to see what the cultivation technique is like in a month. Gu Bei glared at him. This brat was treating his good intentions as ill intent. However, it did seem like he had gone too far. Even someone as strong as a perfected lord could not solve these problems after tens of thousands of years. What was the point of their discussion? He quickly dismissed this brat. He had led hundreds of newcomers, but this was the first time he had encountered such trouble. He was mentally exhausted. There are 17 cultivation techniques suitable for the external sword lineage. Each of them has its own emphasis. Some walk the traditional path, some borrow the power of the stars, some focus on the inner spirit, some start from the 5 elements, and some start from lightning. It all depends on how you choose. When you reach the Jin Dan realm, there will naturally be corresponding cultivation techniques for you to cultivate. There will always be cultivation techniques for you to cultivate. This is a system. During this process, there will be countless supplementary cultivation techniques, sword techniques, and secret techniques to complement it. Cultivating in this way will be the key to the Xianyuan swordsman's unstoppable journey in the world. Lu Xiaoyi thought about it carefully. He was not an arbitrary person. He knew that in the real cultivation world, he was a rookie who did not know anything. At this stage, he did not have the ability to make his own decisions. The experience of his seniors was very important. Senior brother, what advice do you have? Your junior brother is all ears. Gu Bei smiled. Now that's a satisfactory attitude. Every cultivation technique has its own uniqueness. There is no distinction between high and low. In the eyes of a cultivator, the only thing that matters is whether it is compatible with them. However, this kind of thinking is actually limited. The so-called compatibility is actually more important for the future. You are just a small foundation establishment cultivator now. In terms of compatibility, there are not many choices. For example, spirit or lightning. Are these things compatible with you now? Therefore, in my opinion, instead of guessing what path you should take in the future, what path is the most suitable for you? It is better to build a good foundation first. Under the premise of building a good foundation, you can slowly search for the path that is most suitable for you. This is the right path. What is the foundation? I believe that tradition and the 5 elements are the foundation. It will never be outdated in a cultivator's future cultivation. You can choose traditional cultivation, or you can start from the 5 elements. According to the attributes of your 5 elements, you can determine your initial direction. Lu Xiaoyi scratched his head. 5 elements? I don't seem to be too clear about my 5 elements. Chapter 193. P.S. A lot of people are saying that my recent chapters are a little lame. Here, I accept the criticism and explain myself. When writing about swords, there are some basic things that must be written, especially those related to internal and external swords. The entire book has millions of words, and it will only be introduced when you first enter Xianyuan. After that, it won't be mentioned again. For a book with millions of words, it's not too much, right? There are old friends and new friends reading the book. Old friends find it cliched, but new friends find it difficult to understand the system of swordsmanship. I have to give them an explanation. I can't just say, "Okay, I won't write the details." You can spend a few hundred yuan to see my sword apprentice. Thank you for your patience. It will be over soon, and then it will be little Yi's life as a sword apprentice. In order to let my old friends pass this stage quickly, I'll write 10 chapters today. Is that enough? Monthly tickets and subscriptions can't be stopped. I'll give everyone fat. Taoist Gu Bei was completely speechless. This guy, he's already built his foundation, but he still doesn't know his 5 elements bias. I really don't know how he built his foundation. But it's also possible. As a loose cultivator, it's impossible for him to go through the set of procedures inherent in a sect. Even if he's poor, it's not surprising that he can't come into contact with some basic things. It's really tiring. How is this being a guide? This is being a father. He took out an item and shouted, "Troublesome thing! Sit down! I'll test it for you right now." Lu Xiaoyi was a little doubtful. "Can I do it, senior brother? This is an important matter that concerns your junior brother's future." "You can't fool me," Gu Bei scolded. "Before I became a guide, I did chores in the Ascension Hall for 30 years. One of the most important tasks was to test people's spiritual roots. Do you think I can do it? Do you think it's something great? Any foundation-building cultivator with a little bit of experience can do this. Including yourself. If I didn't know you're in a hurry to find a cultivation method and can't grasp it without the 5 elements bias as a guide, I wouldn't have wasted my time. I'll just let you mess around. You can figure it out yourself." Gu Bei's movements were nimble. His technique was experienced and swift, and his tool was powerful. It was not something that Lu Xiaoyi's 5 elements compass could compare to. In less than half an hour, the result was already out. Yes, water, 7 wood, 2 earth, 5 fire, 4 metal, and 1. Your attribute belongs to the balanced attribute. It has no strength or weakness. It can be considered a rare balanced attribute. Lu Xiaoyi was quite familiar with the 5 elements of man. 7 out of water and 2 out of wood meant that the water element accounted for 70%, the wood element accounted for 20%, and the other 3 elements added together accounted for 10%. In this 10%, the earth element accounted for 50%, fire element accounted for 40%, and metal element accounted for 1%. The balance of the 5 elements did not mean that each element occupied 20% of the human body. The human body was a very complicated thing, and there was no possibility of the 5 elements being missing, because the 5 elements were the foundation. If one was missing one would not be able to become a spirit. They all affected and supplemented each other. Water accounted for most of it, but there was a limit to it. That was because the human body was actually a carbohydrate. If fire was the main factor, what would happen? Metal, wood, water, fire, earth, 1, 2, 7, 4, 5. This was the ratio of the 5 elements of an ordinary human after a long period of development in the cultivation world. It was the same for everyone, and there were no exceptions. Unless you were a rock, then you might be of the earth element. If you were a flame, then you were of the fire element. If you were a weapon, then you were of the metal element. But in the cultivation world, there was indeed a saying that cultivators had natal attributes, because very few people had such a balanced attribute. On the basis of this ratio, there would always be changes. For example, more wood, less water, more earth, less wood, and so on. Relatively speaking, if a cultivator's actual 5 elements were compared to the balanced attribute, the natal attribute would increase the most. And the attribute that would decrease the most would be your weak attribute. Is it because the balanced attribute is not popular for swordsmen? Is it because it has no characteristics? Lu Xiaoyi quickly realized this problem. He had tested it himself in his original world, but now that he thought about it, the 5 rings compass was really unreliable. Moreover, he did not have any experience, so his judgment was full of loopholes and had no reference value. Gu Bei was different this time. He was a big sect, so he would not be wrong. Gu Bei smiled bitterly and nodded. This kid was indeed sharp, but he would not say anything nice to deceive him. These were all things that cultivators had to go through in the cultivation world. No matter good or bad, they had to face it. Yes. Whether it was a swordsman or a body cultivator, they would only be good at something if they had a specialty. Only then would they be able to take the lead in the cultivation world. Even if they had the same starting point, he would be better. This was especially true for swordsmen. For example, if a person's natal attribute was metal, then his metal element sword would be stronger than others. If his natal attribute was water, then his flying sword of the water element would be better than others. As a sword cultivator, when choosing a sword technique, the first thing he must consider is his own life. This kind of starting point can give him a certain advantage. Of course, you have your advantage in the metal element, and I have my advantage in the water element. In the end, we will probably be on par and cancel each other out. However, the balanced 5 elements would be more awkward. Because he did not have a special attribute in the 5 elements, he would be weaker than others in the cultivation world. Of course, you could use other methods to make up for it. For example, you could be more talented in battle, be more hardworking, have more perseverance, or have more resources. Lu Xiaoyi heaved a sigh as everything went against him. Gu Bei saw that he was depressed and comforted him. You don't have to be depressed. The higher you go in the cultivation world, the closer you are to the balance attribute. No one could always cultivate their natal attribute. They would have to come into contact with the other 4 elements and achieve the balance attribute. Take the inner sword, for example. After they choose their first sword pill, they would have to familiarize themselves with it before choosing the second and third one. Only when all 5 sword pills are gathered will they have great power. It's the same for us outer swords. After we finish cultivating our natal sword, we would try the other flying swords of the 4 elements. In the end, we would reach the balance attribute. At that time, the disadvantage of your balanced attribute would no longer be a disadvantage. Perhaps it would be weaker when you use a single sword of the 5 elements, but when you use them together, the overall effect would be better. Lu Xiaoyi knew that Gu Bei was comforting him. Perhaps after reaching Jin Dan Yuanying, everyone would pay attention to the balance attribute. But before that, what would he do? Was he going to be bullied by others? There will always be someone suitable for me. Instead of discussing it here, why don't we go in and take a look? Who knows, maybe we'll find someone suitable in an instant. Gu Bei jumped onto the boat. No one can help you with this kind of thing. You can only choose for yourself. Otherwise, you'll blame this and that if you make the wrong choice. I'm not in the mood to listen to your complaints. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Then don't leave. How am I going to return when I come out? If I fly by myself, I'm afraid it'll take me a few days. Gu Bei steered the boat and left. Don't worry. Once you enter this place, you won't be able to come out easily for a few days. Lu Xiaoyi watched as Gu Bei's figure disappeared. He thought to himself that he owed Gu Bei more and more. He could only wait until he became stronger and more capable. Gu Bei had been acting a little strange these few days, but he could not pinpoint what was strange about it. He was always in a hurry, as if something was driving him away. Although they had not known each other for long, he approved of this senior brother of his. However, with his current ability, he was purely a burden. It was difficult for him to be of any help. Looking at the 9 tall buildings in front of him, he felt a sense of pride. He had to walk his own path. No one could stop him from being a free and unfettered rice worm. Thus, he took large strides and walked with the surrounding cultivators towards the Palace of Knowledge. Chapter 194. There were no fixed guards at the entrance of the Heavens AO building. There might be, but he would not be able to discover them. After walking through an unknown array, he could be considered to have truly entered the interior of the Heavens AO building. The building was split into 5 levels and was extremely spacious. In front of the building's entrance, there were rows and rows of green stone tables. On top of them, there was a faint glow of arrays. There were only 20 to 30 people in the entire hall. They were spread out in the spacious hall, and it was unusually quiet. It was not as crowded and bustling as Lu Xiaoyi had imagined. But then again, for things like cultivation techniques, who would not go back to study and cultivate after taking one? It would take at least a few years, or at most a few decades before taking one. It was not like they needed to buy fresh ones every day. There was no one in uniform, nor was there anyone who looked like an attendant. There was only an old man sitting on a chair in an inconspicuous corner, resting with his eyes closed. Occasionally, a cultivator would take out a jade slip and respectfully walk up to the old man to record their names. Gu Bei had explained the procedure very clearly to him. It was not troublesome. Roughly speaking, there were only a few hundred jade scrolls on the first level. According to Gu Bei, the thing he wanted to take was among them. Actually, the target was very obvious. Most of the arrays on the green stone tables were white. Only one place had a faint yellow glow. It was different from the rest. Lu Xiaoyu was not in a hurry. Since he was here, of course he had to take a good look. Hence, he started from the entrance of the building and followed the order of the tables, looking down one by one. After 10,000 years of inheritance, the details were arranged very carefully. Very few people would touch the real cultivation technique jade scrolls in the array. Because once you picked it up, your choice was basically decided. Everyone was looking at the introduction scrolls outside the array. These things did not need to be pasted. They were just ordinary scrolls. They mainly introduced the origin of the cultivation technique, its effects, taboos, conditions, and so on. Lu Xiaoyu looked for an hour and felt that he could not continue looking. Just as Gu Bei had said, if he planned to look through all the introductions of the cultivation techniques, he would not be able to leave this building without a few months. It was really not a good thing to have too many cultivation techniques. It made it hard for people to choose from them. It was more like a way to show off. After figuring this out, Lu Xiaoyu walked directly to the yellow light. There was not a single person in this place. It was not that it was not important, but it was too important. Therefore, every new disciple would choose this place at the first opportunity. They would not dilly-dally like Lu Xiaoyu. He walked closer and took a closer look. The foundation building chapter of the Yellow Court Interior, the foundation building chapter of the Taoist scripture of internal nourishment, the immeasurable small world, the first chapter of the Big Dipper scripture, the first chapter of the Xianling mystic technique, the primal chaos Tao foundation, the heart of heaven, the sound of thunder, the thunder of thunder, the heart sutra of embryonic breathing, the heart sutra of the heart, the 6 Ding and 6 Jiao awakening, the 3 yang. Inwardly, the 4 clearances seclusion technique, the 3 caves treasure pouch, the 5 elements shifting foundation building chapter, the wind and thunder you steps, and the 3 lights 9 transformations mantra. These were the 17 main foundation building exercises of the external sword. The remaining 6 techniques were all enveloped by the yellow light. However, he decided to choose from the 17 external sword techniques. He was very clear that with his current ability, he could not choose the most suitable technique from the other techniques. He might be able to in the future, but he definitely could not now. That old fellow Gu Bei had been talking about the 5 elements for a long time. In the end, when he looked at it, there was only one book about the 5 elements. Could it be that his hidden meaning was for him to choose this one? He was not a child. He would not give up his own thoughts just because of someone else's recommendation. This was different from a favor. Therefore, he had to look through the 17 techniques in detail. After 2 hours, he first eliminated a few techniques that he did not feel were obscure, unfamiliar, and seemed to be profound. To him, he agreed with Gu Bei's words. He had plenty of time to try out profound things in the future. The most important thing now was to build his foundation. If he set the difficulty level at hell from the start, he would be looking for trouble. Therefore, after eliminating the immeasurable small world, Xianling mystic technique, chaotic Taoist foundation, Yingyuan thunder, thunder attracting crimson script, embryonic breathing internal technique, 6 Ding 6 Jia, for brightness secluded passage, treasure pouch of 3 caves. He eliminated 9 techniques in one go, giving him a more focused range of choices. The remaining techniques, the foundation building chapter of the inner scenery of the Yellow Court, and the foundation building chapter of the inner cultivation of the Taoist scriptures were the most basic techniques of Taoism. They were not biased, did not conflict, and were not unconventional. They were the purest basic techniques. On this basis, the cultivator could choose any Taoist technique in the future without any obstacles. Moreover, the speed of one's cultivation, the cultivation of one's mana, the tempering of one's body, and the balance of one's spirit were also the best choices. Among the 17 techniques, Tianqinzhou was the only technique that vaguely involved the cultivation of one's spirit. The reason why he kept it was because his spirit was different from ordinary people. He wondered if there would be an unexpected surprise if it was combined with this technique. The internal notes of the three suns was one of the few techniques that focused on the speed of cultivation. In the introduction, it said that in terms of the speed of cultivation, this technique was unique among the other techniques. In the first chapter of the Big Dipper scripture, he had an indescribable love for the stars. Perhaps it was because his soul had drifted in the universe for a long time, he regarded them as friends who could not speak. He also regarded himself as a star that could not shine. It was as if he would not feel lonely only when he was among the stars in the universe. The foundation building chapter of the 5 elements shift, the wind and thunder steps, and the mantra of 3 lights and 9 changes were all techniques that were closely related to combat. From their names, it could be seen that they were almost blending speed into the technique. It was a bit similar to what Lu Xiaoyi did in the Gobi, pursuing the ability to attack while moving. This was his favorite method. Choice. A cultivator would always face countless choices in his life. If he made the wrong choice this time, he would have to wait 10 years to correct it. He once again activated the method of elimination. He first eliminated the internal notes of the 3 suns. Thinking about it carefully, it was not a good thing to only focus on the speed of cultivation. For a few decades, your cultivation might suppress others, but when everyone reached the peak of the foundation building realm, the weakness of this technique would be exposed. It was not good for the formation of the gold core. Moreover, swordsman was not an orthodoxy that relied on cultivation to win. Swordsman looked at explosive power. 1, 2, 3 pay the bill. There were very few situations where they were entangled with each other. Then, he erased Tianqinzhou. Although it was very unique to use the foundation building realm to train one's spirit, it was twice the effort for half the result. A lot of effort and a lot of gain did not match, and the cost-effectiveness ratio was very low. The key point was that Lu Xiaoyi's unique spirit training technique was completely incompatible with Tianqinzhou. If he had to train his spirit, he might as well choose the Big Dipper scripture. At least it was related to the stars, and he might be able to learn from each other. There were still 6 books left. Choosing was giving him a headache. He had to choose between the foundation, the combination of cultivation and combat, and the feeling of intimacy. Life was like a dream. When he needed to spend spirit stones to buy them, he didn't seem to have such worries. Now that there was a free one in front of him, he Chapter 195. Lu Xiaoyi asked himself. With his personality, temper, and the fact that he wanted to keep a low profile, he got himself into trouble from time to time. He did not go looking for others, but others always came looking for him. Also, in a world as big as the 5 rings, would there be another fragment of fate-bearer or more? If he considered all of this, he doubted if he would have the time to cultivate in peace for a few decades to build a good foundation. Moreover, the Xianyuan sword school was not a hidden sect. The entire 5 rings was in the process of making progress, and Xianyuan was one of the pioneers. If the Yuanian grand cultivators were like this, he did not believe that the low and middle level cultivators would be so quiet. Judging from this, if he did not consider the pure foundation, there were only 4 left. Shifting of the 5 elements, wind and thunder steps, 3 lights and 9 transformations, Big Dipper scripture. Lightning, he yearned for it, but it depended too much on the environment. There was no lightning in the snow mountain. If he wanted to cultivate lightning, he could only enter the small world of lightning. The small world of lightning was only completely open to Jean Dan, and there was also a time limit. The requirements for opening it to Foundation establishment were extremely strict. He needed to compete among tens of thousands of swordsmen outside Foundation establishment. His current situation was not suitable. Shifting of the 5 elements, and 3 lights and 9 transformations were both profound tasks. It seemed a little complicated. Although he had the 5 elements body, he did not think that he had a better understanding of the 5 elements than others. The key was that he was a little lazy. I am actually a very emotional person. Lu Xiai sighed. He took out his sex sword talisman and held it in his hand. He reached in and took out a jade scroll with the first chapter of the Big Dipper scripture. When he took it out, he relaxed. There was no need to look at the rest, and he could not take it away. He took the jade scroll to the old man to register. The old man did not move at all. He did not even look at it. After he finished registering, he waited for him to leave the building before muttering, "Another one looking for trouble." In the first Heaven's AO tower, it took him 8 hours to find a cultivation technique. When a cultivator was immersed in the ocean of cultivation techniques, they would often forget about time. And in front of him, there was an even bigger ocean, the ocean of sword techniques. Lu Xiaoyi did not rest. This kind of mental exhaustion was negligible to him. He walked straight into the Sword Turtle Tower, and realized that compared to the Heaven Turtle Tower, this place was like heaven and earth. There were many people and they were allowed to talk in whispers. Just as Gu Bei had said, the Sword Turtle Cove had over 13,000 sword techniques. Among them, there were over 1,000 that had been passed down directly from Xian Yuan. The swordsman in the sect had comprehended over 7,000 sword techniques on his own during his cultivation. There were also another 3,000 that had been collected from all over the world. With such a large number, it was impossible for him to look through them one by one. If he wanted to find them, he could only start from the martial arts. First, he would choose the martial arts that were most suitable for him. The building was divided into 5 floors, but the first floor was the most lively, because all of Xuanyuan's swordsmanship was here. None of the Zhuji cultivators were stupid. What did Xian Yuan rely on to achieve what he had today? Was it the swordsmanship that came from outside? Was it the swordsmanship that a certain swordsman comprehended on his own? None of them. It was because these were the core swordsmanship that was passed down directly from him. Even if you were given 1,000 years, you wouldn't be able to learn all of them. And when you reached the level of Jin Dan's Yuaning, you might be able to comprehend all the swordsmanship in a single night. The great Tao was interlinked, and so were the swordsmanship. When one reached the level and grasped the fundamentals, learning would be as easy as flipping one's hand. Hence, most people would still only search here. Regardless of whether it was a newcomer like Lu Xiaoyi or someone who had practiced for decades, compared to Lu Xiaoyi, they only knew a few more sword techniques. Compared to the thousands of sword techniques, there wasn't much of a difference. According to Gu Bei, the swordsmanship of the inner sword was much lesser than that of the outer sword. From the looks of it, what was lesser was the essence. The outer sword was a sea of swordsmanship that covered the sky and covered the earth, leaving many newcomers at a loss. After these few days of experience, Lu Xiaoyi completely understood and accepted this identity. In his words, since he couldn't resist it, he might as well enjoy it. He didn't know much about Xuanyuan's swordsmanship, but after seeing so many choices, he immediately understood what he had to do. He couldn't choose the swordsmanship based on whether it was powerful or not. He had to choose the one that was most suitable for him, even if it was the most ordinary one. He began to skim through these Xuanyuan's swordsmanship. The more he looked, the more surprised he was. The more he looked, the more his head hurt, and the more disappointed he was. He began to jump through the choices. After skimming through hundreds of swordsmanship, his mood had dropped to the freezing point. 3 days later, the exhausted him had no choice but to walk out of the Sword Turtle Tower in an attempt to quell his disappointment. A fact that surprised him was that every sword technique here required a sword formation to be carved on the flying sword to complete the production of the flying sword. The so-called external sword technique, in fact, was mostly reflected in the changes of the sword formation carved on the flying sword. The mortal world sword completely changed the swordsmanship through the movements of the hand. Of course, if one wanted to use one's feet to wield the sword, that was up to one as well. The inner sword used mana to remove the sword pill and formed the sword aura to leave the body. Through the control of one's spirit, the construction of the swordsmanship was completed. These two swordsmanship methods were very direct and simple. This resulted in the sword in one's hand being invincible within 3 feet. The sword pill and sword aura could be changed at one's will. These were the most natural ways. The outer sword was neither fish nor fowl. It could reach as far as the inner sword, or even further. However, it had the form of a sword, like a hand holding a sword. So, how did it do all this? Originally, Liu Xiaoyi thought that it was just like the object controlling technique, which was to control the flying sword with mana. But now, it seemed that he had underestimated this problem. Using the object controlling technique to control the flying sword could only be called the object controlling technique, and not the flying sword technique. In order to achieve a sufficient level of power, range, and all kinds of strange special effects, this was not something that could be achieved simply by using telekinesis. One had to carve a sword array on the flying sword to maximize its attack power. Only then could it be called a flying sword. For example, the Ice Spirit Cold Light Sword was a typical outer sword technique of the Foundation establishment stage. It had 9 layers. In other words, one could carve the Ice Spirit Cold Light Sword formation on the flying sword 9 times, one layer after another. When carving the next layer, the structure of the previous layer could not be damaged. Otherwise, the flying sword would be a failure. When your cultivation becomes more and more profound, your control becomes stronger and stronger, and your grasp of the sword formation becomes more and more profound. When you finally spend several years or even several decades to complete the engraving of the 9 layers, then congratulations, you have successfully cultivated the sword of Ice Spirit Cold Light and achieved great success. You can then look for the next external sword art. Therefore, every outer swordsman was a formation master, or at least, a micro-carving sword formation master. The maximum number of Foundation establishment swordsmen's carving was 9. Therefore, most Foundation establishment outer sword techniques were limited by this number. This depended on the depth of the Foundation establishment cultivator's mana and the degree of control of his spirit. It was not simply because the number 9 was auspicious and coincided with the Great Way. Chapter 196. If the sword formation provided by an external swordsmanship could only be carved with 6 or 7 layers, it would be classified as an ordinary swordsmanship. If it could reach 8 or 9 layers, it would be a high-level swordsmanship. Occasionally, there would be a sword formation that could reach 10 or 11 layers, and that would be a top-notch swordsmanship. Everyone would scramble for it, and treat it as a hidden trump card. However, not every cultivator could cultivate their swordsmanship to such a level. It meant a lot of things, not just a matter of hard work and talent. If one reached the Jin Dan, the so-called improvement in swordsmanship would mostly be reflected in the carving of sword formations. The limit of a Jin Dan was 39 layers. A flying sword carved with more than 30 layers of sword formations was very terrifying. In terms of the power of a single sword, it was far above the inner swordsmanship. The upper limit of a Yuaning external sword was raised to 99 layers. It sounded incredible, but the problem was that when the flying sword was destroyed, it meant that the swordsmanship that one had spent so many years cultivating was gone. The person was still there, but the sword was gone, which meant that the swordsmanship was gone too. Perhaps one could still refine another one after the event. Not to mention how much time, energy, and resources it would take. But since it was in the middle of a battle, what would happen if the swordsmanship was gone? Therefore, senior external swordsmen usually had many flying swords. Some were used to test the depletion of energy, some were used as the main force in battle, and some were kept as a trump card for the most crucial moment. It sounded safe and reasonable, But the difference between them and an inner swordsman was in these aspects. An inner swordsman did not care about the depletion of energy. They could use their strongest moves from the beginning all the way to the end. This was how the battle strength was pulled apart. Of course, Yuanying and cultivators of a higher level were better. They had fewer concerns in this aspect, because when a flying sword was carved to 99 layers or more, there was a chance that a sword spirit would be born. With a sword spirit, there was a lot more room for maneuver. Not only would the attack be more flexible and intelligent, but it could also self-repair and improve. However, these were too far away for Lu Xiaoyi to consider. His problem was that after understanding the fighting style of an external sword and the source of power of an external swordsmanship, he completely understood the difficulties he had to face in order to achieve success in the path of an external sword. Resources were very important to an external sword. It almost ran through the entire cultivation life of an external swordsman. If you want to carve more sword formations, the flying swords you prepare can't be weak, right? It had to be made of top-grade cultivation materials, right? Every additional layer of the sword array had a special material requirement in order to achieve the desired effect. These heavenly materials and earthly treasures, the sect would not give them to you for free. Instead, you would have to collect them yourself, do business, complete missions, and kill people to seize their treasures. Even if you had to sell your grain, then you'll need a second flying sword, a third flying sword. It was true that Xianyuan Sword School did not require you to pay a single spirit stone for the cultivation methods and sword arts, but in the following cultivation, everyone was pulled into the busy business of creating wealth and promoting consumption. Of course, it wasn't just Xianyuan that was like this. In fact, every big sect was no different. If you can crawl back up, that's your ability. If you can't crawl back up, then you'll disappear into the crowd. No one will pity you because there are too many people who need pity. He was not a second or third generation cultivator, nor did he have a thigh to rely on, nor did he have any property. Where could he find so many resources to fill this big hole? Don't they need resources in other aspects? Just rely on the half-yearly allowance given by the sect? If he wanted to do business, go on missions, refine pills, and draw talismans, not to mention whether he had the talent or not, even if he did, how could he waste his time like this? Cultivation was interrelated. If there was a problem in one aspect, it would affect everything. Needless to say, he really didn't have the mood to do this. The biggest wish of a rice worm was to do what he liked. If he came all the way here to do this, wouldn't it be fine if he stayed in his original world to do business and refine pills? In terms of resources alone, he had fallen into a dead end. Presumably, it wasn't just him, but also the vast majority of small foundation establishment cultivators who had no one to rely on. Even if he had so many resources, the flying sword that he spent so much effort to create couldn't be used to his heart's content in all situations. Then what was he after? Lu Xiaoyi really didn't have any lofty ambitions, but his vision was there. He had an intuition about swords that he didn't know where it came from. This intuition helped him kill many enemies in the early stages. Now, he felt that there was a problem with the so-called external sword technique. If he continued to practice like this, he would forever be a hidden external swordsman. It wasn't that he didn't want to show off, but that he couldn't. Challenge Wen Chang? Was that even possible? He could only tuck his tail between his legs and pray to the heavens that the other party would forget him. He had to find a new method. It wouldn't consume so much resources. He wouldn't have to worry so much about the flying sword. He wouldn't have to spend all his time thinking about carving this and that on the sword. He wouldn't have to put all his thoughts on external objects. He wouldn't even want to pick up a rock to see if it was a heavenly treasure. Although he still couldn't find such a method, he would rather not practice anything than to use all his energy and end up eating farts behind someone else's back. Because it didn't matter, because of his innate intuition towards swords, he, a small foundation establishment cultivator, rejected a technique that had been passed down for tens of thousands of years from the bottom of his heart. This was somewhat inconceivable. If he had a master, he would probably be hung up and beaten up. After figuring out the cause and effect, he felt much more relaxed. He walked into the Sword Turtle Tower, grabbed a jade scroll, and left. The old cultivator who was in charge of registration at the door saw this, and couldn't help but be very curious. In the register, this newcomer had chosen the most difficult cultivation technique. Instead, he chose the lowest level sword technique in terms of swordsmanship. The Sword Song of the Four Seasons. This was the sword technique with the least number of layers in the sword formation among the tens of thousands of sword techniques in the Sword Turtle Tower. There were only 5 layers. Furthermore, the materials used to carve it were simple and cheap. If it wasn't for its uniqueness, it wouldn't even be kept in the Sword Turtle Tower. The so-called 4 seasons here did not necessarily refer to the 4 seasons of the year: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The seasons here referred to a period of time. There were 3 seasons in a season. It could refer to 6 hours, 3 months, or 3 years. It didn't only refer to the seasons. Inma was spring, Siwue was summer, Shinyoshi was autumn, and Haiziku was winter. Inma was wood, Siwue was fire, Shinyu was metal, Haiziku was water, and Shinweishi was earth. Therefore, the Sword Song of the Four Seasons actually had 5 layers. Metal, wood, water, fire, and earth were all used to carve the sword formation using the most basic materials of the 5 elements. Therefore, it was relatively economical. The most difficult cultivation technique and the cheapest sword technique. What kind of combination was this? Lu Xiaoyi felt relaxed. When you felt that you had made the most suitable choice among the tens of thousands of sword techniques, anyone would feel relaxed. He had chosen the Sword Song of the Four Seasons because it had the least number of layers and saved the most resources. Although he didn't think much of the fighting style of the external sword, this was after all a legacy that had been passed down for tens of thousands of years. The internal sword was the core, and the external sword was the body. It had its own reasons for existing. His goal was to use this sword technique that didn't cost much to judge the strengths and weaknesses of the entire external sword system. You could have your own opinions about it, but you had to respect its achievements. Chapter 197. His next target was the Wind Ao Tower, the Tower of Escape Techniques. To him, the passion for speed was ingrained in his bones. Even the choice of techniques was based on speed. Of course, he had to come here to see if there was anything special. In one day, Lu Xiaoyi was in a dilemma. He was drifting between the 5 elements escape technique and the starlight technique. The essence of heaven and earth was the 5 elements. The essence of flying was how to overcome the resistance of the 5 elements. The essence of the 5 elements escape technique was how to integrate the cultivator into the environment of the 5 elements, turning resistance into assistance. This was the strength of the 5 elements escape technique. Furthermore, cultivating the 5 elements escape technique could be based on the foundation of the 5 elements. It was not as simple as just one escape technique. The starlight technique was much simpler. In short, he liked it. He sighed. Since he was sentimental once, he might as well stay sentimental until the end. In order to prevent himself from biting off more than he could chew, the Xianyuan sword sect limited their disciples to 9 secret techniques. He already had one of the 3 secret techniques. He had only chosen one of the 3 secret techniques. However, he could not bring the remaining secret techniques to other areas. He could only leave it empty for now. This meant that in the remaining Cloud Ao Tower and Mountain Ao Tower, he could still choose 4 secret techniques. From his perspective, the secret techniques could also determine victory or defeat. When fighting with others, it was never a simple thing. Swordsmanship was very important, but it was only the main part. There were many other things. In his life of fighting, almost all of his opponents were stronger than him. But so what? Didn't they all die in his hands in the end? Hence, he did not feel that giving up on swordsmanship was the same as giving up on combat power. In terms of secret techniques, he could still make up for it. He placed his hopes on secret techniques. This was because in Xuanyuan's external swordsmanship, secret techniques were the most common. Furthermore, many of the secret techniques were above Xuanyuan's direct techniques. This was not an area that a cold-blooded swordsman like Xian Yuan was good at. The ancestors of swordsmen in this area were orthodox Taoists. Therefore, the strange things that swordsmen brought back through other channels were often more awesome, novel, and imaginative than Xuanyuan's own. Actions could solidify one's thinking. Swordsmen's way of thinking had been fixed for thousands of years. Directness, speed, and sharpness had become their motto in battle. It was easy to imagine that swordsmen were trash when it came to dirty tricks, and they were the type that was hopeless. These were not his own thoughts, but Gu Bei had told him. However, it was a warning him not to spend too much time on these deviant aspects. Lu Xiaoyi's current thoughts were the exact opposite of what he had said. The Cloud Turtle building was also the last building that Lu Xiaoyi needed to enter now. After that, he did not have the qualifications to enter the Golden Elixir building and the Mysterious building. The Miscellaneous building and the Opponent building were not what he urgently needed now. The cultivators in Cloud Turtle Tower were second only to Sword Turtle Tower. Everyone was not stupid. Lu Xiaoyi was not the only one who understood the meaning of secret techniques. It was just that everyone had different directions. Lu Xiaoyi went straight for the detection techniques. His strength was not as good as his senses. If he could not beat him, he could just hide. The prerequisite was that he had to discover his opponent first. This was not to be taken for granted. Because his spiritual power was different from ordinary people, he actually had an advantage in terms of divine sense. What he needed to do now was to make up for his shortcomings in other areas. Divine sense was very important, but it could not cover everything. Especially after the opponent had deliberately concealed themselves, the cultivator needed to form a strong field of perception in other areas to make up for the shortcomings. His problem was that other than divine sense, there were 5 other types of senses. However, he only had 4 choices. Therefore, he could not find individual detection techniques. He had to find a systematic detection technique that included all 6 senses. If he chose this, the range would be much smaller. Finally, he found a technique that was somewhat related to Buddhism. Bai's advancement of 6 senses. In the cultivation world, Taoism and Buddhism were not completely separated. Many things were connected. Under the same sky, how could there be completely opposite positions of cultivation? In many aspects, it was just a different soup but not the same medicine. Buddhism had many things that were unique. Among them, the elaboration of the 6 senses was the creation of Buddhism. In this aspect, Taoism did not see it as a heresy. They often used it as a reference. For this thing to be placed here openly for people to choose, it actually represented Xianyuan. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi chose it because this secret technique was equivalent to 6. It was very worth it. The remaining directions were a little vague and uncertain. Should he start over in an unfamiliar direction or continue to strengthen in the direction he was good at? It was a headache. There were more than 4,000 techniques in Cloud Turtle Brothel. He decided to be presumptuous this time and look through them thoroughly. He quickly browsed through the introductions and strived to not miss anything that was useful to him. He was not the only one who did this. This was because it was very difficult to have a fixed system for subsidy methods. They were often unconstrained. Everyone's method was the same. One by one. They would always find something that they liked. Lu Xiaoyi did not even exclude the Tao of pills, talismans, and medicine. He was very repulsed by these things that could form their own Tao. In terms of depth, Xuanyuan's things were mostly superficial. They could not be compared to those orthodox Taoism. Gu Bei also admitted this. However, there could be unexpected surprises within. Most of the cultivators here were in the same situation as him. They quickly picked up an introductory book and skimmed through it. They put it down and picked up the next book. Then, they slowly moved forward in an orderly manner. They did not interfere with each other. If they fancied something, they would just memorize it in their hearts. After going through all of them, they would study it again. They went from the 1st floor to the 5th floor, then from the 5th floor to the 1st floor. They chose close to 100 targets and carefully studied their uses, origins, and effects. This method of choosing techniques was very painful for cultivators. It was far from having a master to guide them in the right direction. However, compared to the long lifespan of a cultivator, this delay was nothing. Xianyuan had always insisted on using this clumsy and troublesome method. It was also easy to make mistakes. He had his own deep considerations. There was an advantage to using this method. Every swordsman's choice was different. Their future achievements would also be different. This could ensure that the entire sect would flourish. This method was the best choice for a sect, but it might not be the same for an individual. This was because there would always be people who would take the wrong path when making a choice. Sacrificing a portion of the cultivator's future to ensure that the sect would be full of vitality on the path of Tao sounded cruel. However, this was also the norm in the cultivation world. This was the power of a sect. It was a place where adults fought against the heavens. It was not a kindergarten. No one could guarantee anything. Chapter 198. 10 days later, several jade slips appeared in Lu Xiaoyi's hand. Spirit concealment technique. This was a type of breath concealment technique. Almost every new disciple would look for this type of technique to rely on in the future when they traveled the world. Whether it was hiding or fleeing, who could guarantee that they would always have a smooth sailing? Everyone had the heart to pretend to be weak. Disguising oneself as a harmless low-level cultivator or even a mortal was every cultivator's dream. There were very few exceptions. There were many such breath concealment techniques, no less than 50. Each had their own unique moves and each had its own emphasis. Spirit concealment technique was one of the rarer ones. Very few cultivators chose it because its breath concealment technique was achieved through mental power, and not the usual method of controlling magic power to breathe and calm the fetus. Its effect was very unique. It could hide a cultivator's breath concealment technique to a great extent. Most importantly, it could be done while moving. Why didn't anyone choose such a good breath concealment technique? It was because it was a breath concealment technique controlled by mental power. For foundation establishment cultivators, the training of mental power was a difficult and forbidden area. Only by reaching Jin Dan would a cultivator's mental power make a qualitative leap. Therefore, if one's mental power wasn't strong enough, naturally the effect wouldn't be good. Knowing that this breath concealment technique couldn't be cultivated to a high level in foundation establishment, who would waste time and effort? But Lu Xiaoyi chose this because he could make use of his strong points. He had mental power that far surpassed cultivators of the same level. What others couldn't do, he might be able to do. Moreover, he liked the ability to breath concealment technique while moving. It was a necessity for sneak attacks. The second jade slip was soul fighting technique. It was to use one's own divine sense to detect the other's divine sense, thus achieving the goal of influencing, guiding, diverting, and even exploding. Mental power had always been a main direction of cultivators' battles. The higher the realm, the more so. In the foundation establishment stage, cultivators still couldn't rely on mental power to kill or seriously injure their opponents, but they could still influence them to a certain extent. Similarly, very few cultivators would choose the soul combat technique because it was also built on the foundation of a strong spiritual power. To kill 1,000 enemies, you would suffer 800 casualties. This was the characteristic of a battle of spiritual power. No one dared to say that their spiritual power was stronger than their opponents. There were many precedents of carelessness that could backfire. However, for Lu Xiaoyi, this was his field of expertise. In cultivation and battle, the most important thing was to maximize one's strength and limit the opponent's advantage. This principle was not difficult to understand. The difficult part was to what extent one could excel at. This was what he had gained over the past 10 days. There was still one spot left for him to choose from, because he had to leave a spot for body arts. This was a must. Unlike when he was at the Sword Turtle Tower, he wanted to solve the problem in one go here. He didn't want to struggle in the sea of books again. It was too tiring. Moreover, the more he read, the more his heart itched. He thought back to all the magical techniques he had learned in the past few days. Although he was a bit hesitant, he still went back to the 5th floor. The magical techniques here were quite remote. For example, divination was on this floor. A swordsman also learned divination? This was very normal in the cultivation world. In fact, not only swordsmen, but Orthodox Taoists, body cultivators, Buddhists, and so on also practiced divination. Divination was a key point for cultivators to measure their own mysterious abilities. It was a way to materialize premonitions, intuitions, and whims. It was also a very powerful ability. Of course, compared to professional divination, they were still far behind. Moreover, they were not willing to pay a certain price to improve the accuracy of a certain divination. This was the difference between professionals and amateurs. Xianyuan Sword School's divination was at the amateur level. It could also be the spoils of war after a certain attack. Its origin was unknown. Those who came here to choose magical techniques were basically old foundation establishment cultivators. They had no hope of reaching the upper realm and wanted to learn new things to entertain themselves. Otherwise, they wanted to make one last attempt, trying to rely on the mysteries in the unseen world to tell them what to do. However, it seemed that no one had ever succeeded. It was always a thought. What if? Young foundation establishment cultivators certainly wouldn't choose this kind of magical technique. They hadn't experienced the cruel grinding of the cultivation world in Xianyuan until all their drive and ideals were exhausted. Therefore, when Lu Xiaoyi came here to choose magical techniques, the few old foundation establishment cultivators felt very strange. Of course, no one tried to persuade him. Although he was young, he was still in his 20s. How could he not understand this principle? Divination meant to observe. Divination meant to burn a tortoise shell with fire. It was believed that the shape of the cracks on the shell could predict good or bad fortune. This was the most ancient divination technique. However, when the cultivators also joined in, divination was no longer something that the priests pretended to be mysterious. It began to become systematic and more accurate. Moreover, it extended in many directions. Stargazing was one of the most important directions. Observing the celestial phenomena on a certain night. This was probably the most common way for stargazers. Stargazing Yixiang was such a thing. By observing the position of the stars in the sky, brightness, strength, and comparison, and adding in some unique Taoist theories of divination, one could complete the judgment of simple things, good or bad, and trends. Lu Xiaoyi didn't understand this at all. The reason why he chose this was because stargazing Yixiang had a very unique observation prerequisite. Through stargazing, one could place oneself in the midst of the stars and become a part of the stars. Of course, it wasn't really going to the universe. It was just that one's consciousness was incomparably close to the stars. Lu Xiaoyi didn't care about how he would use divination to determine good or bad luck, but he was very concerned about whether he could use this method to get close to the stars in the universe. He was very clear that if he didn't reach the Yuanying realm in this lifetime, it would be very difficult for him to have the opportunity to enter the universe again, unless he was kidnapped again. With the strength of a 5-ringed soul master, this was very unlikely. This meant that he could no longer use stargazing in the universe to improve his spirit and spirit. Then, could the prerequisite of stargazing Yixiang help him achieve the same stargazing effect as in the universe? It was very worth looking forward to. Maybe it could. Maybe it couldn't. Or maybe it could achieve a partial effect. This was very important to him. It is said that 10,000 years ago in the cultivation world, the foundation establishment cultivation method at that time also had a method to train the soul. However, after 10,000 years of cultivation world development, cultivators discovered that forcing the soul to train during the foundation establishment stage was more harmful than beneficial to cultivators. Thus, this kind of cultivation method began to slowly disappear from the various large sections. Maybe there were still some, but it had to be under the strict supervision of the teachers. Or maybe it was a treatment that only elite disciples could enjoy. Lu Xiaoyu was very clear that he probably wouldn't have such an opportunity, so he decided to use his own method. He wasn't worried about any problems because he had used this method in the universe for countless years. Chapter 199. At this point, he had used up all 3 quotas, all of which were related to the mind. This was the only thing he could find that he was good at. It had been more than half a month since he entered the Boa Tower. Gu Bei was right. Once a newcomer entered, they would lose track of time, even if he felt that his willpower was not bad. There was another tower, the Mountain Turtle Tower. He needed to choose a body technique for himself. For his current close combat ability, his body was very important. At least he could persevere until he could be saved. He used less than a day to choose a body technique for himself, the Purple Star Body. There were too many directions for body cultivation. Just by looking at the fact that body cultivation could be compared to spell cultivation and swordsman, one could see how broad and profound this direction was. The body was the foundation. It was also the earliest direction of cultivation when it first appeared. Later on, there was Qi, then there was the soul, then there was the rest. So there were too many types to count. Lu Xiaoyu did not want to train himself to have infinite strength, blood, and the appearance of a monster. That was the direction of a true body cultivator, not the direction of a swordsman. In terms of use, swordsmen choosing body techniques was no different from spell cultivators choosing body techniques. They paid more attention to the overall structure and coordination of the body. Body cultivation was to break through to the next level, not to use the body to beat people up. Since they were all based on the stars, they naturally had to form a system. At this point, there was no longer any room for him to choose other cultivation techniques. His main cultivation technique, escape technique, and body technique all came from the stars, which could greatly reduce his cultivation time. It could not be said that he had a full harvest, but he was satisfied in all directions except for sword techniques. The first chapter of the Big Dipper Sutra, Starlight Spell Induction, Purple Star Body, 4 Seasons Sword Song, Divine Concealment Spell, Soul Fighting Spell, Astral Vision Transformation. If Gu Bei saw his choice, he would definitely scold him for not knowing how to cherish it. Because in the eyes of the elders, his choice was a classic example of being ignorant and biting off more than one could chew. Regarding the situation of the Star Dao in Xianyuan, it could be summed up in one sentence: nice to hear, but not useful. In the early and middle stages of entering the path of cultivation, it was not powerful enough. In the later stages, when facing other great paths, it lacked the ability to make a decisive decision. Therefore, in the history of Xianyuan, there were very few great cultivators who were famous for their stellar swordsmanship. This was the case for the external swords, and it was the same for the internal swords as well. There were several lineages in the internal swords. The Zongjian lineage had great Emperor Xianyuan, the Yijian lineage had 4th ancestor Hengzhou, the Killing Sword lineage had 6th ancestor Wei Ji, and it was said that the Dao Sword lineage had a major character who could shake the heavens and earth. However, the Star Sword lineage was in an awkward position, unable to bring out anyone who could stand up for them. Especially in the Jin Dan stage of foundation building, because they could not really come into contact with the universe, and they were always separated from the stars by a very important layer, the atmosphere. Regardless of whether it was martial arts or swordsmanship, they were all of little value. The sword song of the 4 seasons was chosen to save money. It was a short-sighted decision. As for the other 3, there was no need to even mention them. How many foundation establishment cultivators could perfectly resolve them on the spiritual level? However, Gu Bei did not see it. Because he wasn't here. Lu Xiaoyu searched around the buildings but did not find him. However, he was not surprised. He had stayed inside for 19 days, and naturally, he could not expect others to wait outside for 19 days. Just as he was hesitating whether he should go back by himself, or wait a little longer, a middle-aged swordsman came in front of him. "Cigarette butt, is it?" I'm here on behalf of Senior Gubei. The sect's guidance to you will last for another 5 days. If there's anything you don't know, you can ask me. Just treat me as Senior Gubei. Lu Xiaoyu was very puzzled. May I ask for Senior Gubei's name? Is there something wrong with Senior Gubei? I'm Yuguan, and also your Senior Gubei. He sighed. What could be wrong with him? It's just that his age has come, and he's been summoned by impermanence. 7 days ago, he passed away in the cave. If it wasn't for the abnormality in his soul lamp, we wouldn't have known. Upon hearing this, Lu Xiaoyu stood in silence for a long time. He finally understood what Gu He meant when he said to Gu Bei in the Ascension Hall. At that time, the 2 martial uncles of Jin Dan already knew about Gu Bei's death. What they meant was for him to prepare for his funeral. It was ridiculous that he was still ignorant about this. The cruelty of cultivation was completely displayed in front of him for the first time, and it was in such a powerful sect. In front of the heavenly Tao, no one could escape from its ultimate judgment. Are you going back to the cave to cultivate? Or are you going somewhere else? Lu Xiaoyu let out a long sigh. Where is Senior Brother Gu Bei buried? I want to take a look. Yu Guan smiled bitterly. We cultivators are different from mortals. We don't have the red tape of cremation or burial. Once we know our lives, we don't leave behind a net. When a person dies, the lamp goes out. Therefore, there is no grave, no monument, no inscription. Lu Xiaoyu asked softly, Senior Gu Bei's funeral? Yu Guan sighed. Don't worry. Xianyuan Sword Sect won't just stand by and do nothing. Martial Uncle Gu He has already made Senior Gu Bei's funeral a mission. Naturally, the other disciples will complete it. Xuanyuan's rule is that newcomers are not allowed to leave the mountain for 3 years. This is not because they are worried about your safety, but because of Xuanyuan's reputation. Do you understand? Lu Xiaoyu didn't have any other thoughts. He asked Yu Guan to send him back to the cave. He said that he wanted to start cultivating and that he would stop here. After they left, Lu Xiaoyu felt lost. It took him a long time to calm down. The first question was he willing to be a rice worm without making a sound? In the cultivation world, without strength, it was not easy to be a rice worm. He cleared his mind and threw away his worries. He put the preface of the Big Dipper scripture on his forehead. Suddenly, countless knowledge flooded his mind. A figure appeared in his mind. His magic power moved and operated. The heavenly cycle of stars was like a bright river of stars. The acupoints in the human body were like stars, corresponding to the stars in the sky, resonating with each other. Finally, the person was the stars, and the stars were the person. After repeating this 3 times, a full quarter of an hour later, the jade strip fell from his forehead. Only then did he truly understand the celestial scryer scripture. However, it was only a peak, far from a small success. Among the 17 external sword cultivation methods, there were easy and difficult ones, fast and slow ones, comprehensive ones, basic ones, recuperation and battle. Among them, the Big Dipper scripture belonged to a mediocre cultivation method. It seemed to touch on everything, but was not outstanding in any aspect. Such a cultivation method was very popular among Taoist cultivators because Taoist cultivators paid attention to balance. However, among swordsman cultivators, having no characteristics was the door of life. Because this meant that you did not have explosive power. Because of familiarity it was cordial, because of cordial, it was compatible. With the stars, Lu Xiaoyu felt that they were a family. Therefore, he moved and determined a point in his body as the Big Dipper. Then, he took the 6 acupoints and connected them to form the 7 stars. The approximate position was similar to the Big Dipper in the starry sky. After he had fully adapted to it, he began to visualize the Big Dipper in outer space to form a connection. Chapter 200. The Big Dipper was shaped like a spoon, and the Big Dipper was the intersection point between the handle and the big spoon. The Big Dipper scripture named this intersection point as the Shinseng acupoint, which corresponded to the Big Dipper Migres star. Going towards the Big Spoon, the Zhigang acupoint corresponded to the Fecta star, the Xuanji acupoint corresponded to the Merak star, and the Yumen acupoint corresponded to the Dubhe star. Going towards the handle, the Lingshu acupoint corresponded to the Aliath star, the Shifeng acupoint corresponded to the Kaiyang star, and the Yumen acupoint corresponded to the Alkade star. This was not the end. When the cultivator was completely familiar with and could freely use this star body technique, more stars would be added. How many acupoints were there in the human body? Limitless. They could be automatically generated by the cultivator's consciousness, creating something out of nothing. How many stars were there in the universe? They were also endless. Therefore, the cultivation of the star body system was an endless process. Of course, it was good to cultivate the Big Dipper when one was in foundation establishment. There was no need to worry about the Big Dipper escaping the control of the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper had existed for more than millions of years, and it had not really escaped from the real big stars in the universe. Lu Shi liked to do things one by one. After doing one, he would move on to the next. The most important thing for him now was to raise his cultivation level. Yu Guan said 3 years, but it was actually a novice protection period. It sounded long, but to a cultivator, it was not long. Whether it was right or wrong to choose the Big Dipper scripture still needed time to test, but there was one thing. The most difficult thing for other cultivators was the process of interacting with the stars in the universe, but it was not a problem for him. This was because of his natural affinity with the stars. The first part of the Big Dipper scripture sounded like a cultivation technique for cultivating star power, but this was a misunderstanding. Its essence was still to absorb spiritual opportunity, but the method of absorption was different from other cultivation techniques. It used the acupoints in the human body as the universe and guided the circulation of magic power according to the laws of the universe. In the beginning, it was the Big Dipper. Later on, more and more were added, forming star regions, star systems, and even the entire universe. The more stars were added, the more spiritual opportunity would be absorbed, and the faster one's cultivation would grow. In the Taoist system, the star element had a very unique position. Those who could cultivate it were all great Taoist powerhouses. Coupled with star spells, they had a certain advantage over cultivators of the same level. They were far better off than those who were in the sword vein. Xuanyuan's predecessors had introduced the lineage of star into the entire sword vein system because of the uniqueness of the star system. They wanted to use it to improve the abilities of the sword vein in different fields. However, after tens of thousands of years of introduction, it seemed that they had not achieved their goal. The star school, which had flourished in orthodox Taoism, was not used to the sword vein. Within the inner sword lineage, there were Emperor Xianyuan, Hangzhou, Wei Ji, and other outstanding characters leading the vertical sword lineage, E-sword lineage, killing sword lineage, and Dao sword lineage, suppressing the star sword lineage. Within the outer sword lineage, the swordsmen had been trying to inscribe stars into the sword array of the flying swords. However, they had not been able to achieve satisfactory results. There were countless obstacles that needed to be overcome. Therefore, the Big Dipper scripture could only be used as a skill to increase one's cultivation. It was very difficult to embody the power of the skill on the flying swords like the other main skills. Of course, this was all in the future. There was no need to think too much about the foundation establishment stage. Whether it was the star realm or the Dao realm, they were all too far away. Their current level was to have a deeper cultivation and inscribe more arrays on the flying swords. That was all. 3 days later, Lu Xiaoyi could feel a slight heat coming from the Migres star, which corresponded to the Shinseng acupoint. That was a phenomenon that occurred when the star force was mixed with spiritual force. This was a watershed. It meant that his Big Dipper scripture had been initiated. The next 6 stars were only a matter of time. A month later, the 7 stars could be felt. His cultivation speed suddenly increased. As expected of a skill that led directly to the great Tao. Even if it was not outstanding among the 7 top skills of Xianyuan, it still stood in the ranks of the top. For a sect like the Xianyuan sect, what was the level of its top cultivation method? Lu Xiaoyi finally felt the foundation of a large sect. It was not something that a frog at the bottom of a well like him could imagine. If his dantian was compared to a lake, then his previous cultivation was like dripping water into it. Not to mention filling it up, he was afraid that it would not even be able to withstand the evaporation of the wind and sun. Now, he had activated the big Ma Li's water pump and crazily poured water into it. The speed of the water pump shocked a country bumpkin like him. He was afraid that there would be problems if the water was poured in too quickly. However, he quickly realized that he was overthinking. He did not understand how big the lake in his dantian was. How much water could it store? Looking at it now, for a foundation establishment cultivator's dantian, only by using this kind of skill could he possibly leave enough time to attack the Jing Dan within the lifespan of a foundation establishment cultivator. He also understood that if he continued to stay in his original world, even if he swallowed all the red thread worms in the desert, he would not have a chance to form his gold core. He also finally understood that he was able to be abducted to Xianyuan. At least in terms of cultivation, it was an enormous opportunity for him. Yet he had been chattering and complaining about it all this time. This was the deviation that came from looking at the world with the eyes of an ant. He prepared to begin correcting this deviation. He had to change his current mentality as soon as possible. Even if he was still an ant now, he was still an ant crawling on a giant's body. He had to adapt to this environment. He could no longer face all of this with an attitude that did not adjust. Right now, he was a Xianyuan swordsman. He could no longer think about magic cultivation or the shady business of being a rice worm. Otherwise, he would be eliminated. Since his skill was already on the right track, he no longer hesitated. He cultivated starlight magic attraction and purple microstar physique at the same time. The evasion art and the body art had to be started first. The first was to run, and the second was to withstand beatings. Evidently, Lu Xiaoyi still had not entered the true state of a swordsman. His attitude towards cultivation was still the same as in his original world. He did not have the slightest awareness of Xuanyuan's spirit. This generally appeared among the abducted cultivators. Like the swordsman of the Fifth Ring or his hometown of Zhuzhou, they had practically received the ideological education of a Xianyuan swordsman from a young age. They pressed forward courageously and would rather die than be afraid as their own life's creed, and persisted in it. After their main skill, they would first choose to cultivate sword skills, and then talk about other things. But the abducted cultivators had many thoughts. They were more flexible, treating this place as a true holy land for cultivation. Future reality would tell them that the dome might be a holy land for cultivation, but it could also be something else. When he could use starlight magic attraction proficiently and purple microstar physique was on the right track, all that was left was to gradually deepen it through cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi began his attempt at astral observation transfiguration. This was also what he relied on to not cultivate sword skills for the time being. He hoped to be able to expand his superiority in mental strength, and expand this advantage to a decisive point. Because of the limitations of the flying sword's range, foundation establishment cultivators were still far from being able to attack without seeing the other party. They were even far from reaching the limits of divine sense. Such limitations determined that a battle between foundation establishment cultivators had to be maintained at a certain distance from each other. Simply put, because of the distance, there was an opportunity to use mental strength to attack. Either using flying swords, or directly getting close. Until he found a suitable way to wield a sword. Chapter 201. This mentality was very strange. A small cultivator from a remote star field came to a super sect in a famous star field in the universe, and wanted to change the sword system that had been passed down for tens of thousands of years. But this was his confidence. He was full of reverence for other things, especially for spells. His reverence was also full of yearning. But when it came to swordsmanship, he had a strange stubbornness that he could not explain. It was as if his choice was the best and no one could change his mind. As long as it was related to swords, he would not listen to anyone's advice. He did not want to change others or change the Xianyuan system, but he felt that it was not suitable for him. He did not love swords, but his views on swords were frighteningly paranoid. He did not even know where his beliefs came from. A few days later, Lu Xiaoyi woke up from his cultivation. After experimenting with the astrovision transformation, he had a rough idea of how helpful this divination technique was to spiritual cultivation. The bad news was that it was impossible to achieve the same level of spiritual growth as in the universe. After all, separated by the atmosphere, this was an insurmountable chasm for a foundation establishment cultivator. The good news was that it was of some help. He had just started practicing and felt that the spiritual growth was insignificant. But if he persevered and visualized the stars for a longer period of time, the growth would increase. But it would not exceed 30% of what it was in the universe. It was also a path that he would not give up on. Cultivation knew no time. Lu Xiaoyi had learned all the secret techniques except for the 4 seasons sword song. Half a year had passed. He had only learned them, but he had not achieved anything yet. He had not achieved the effect of using them to subdue his enemies. In his original world, he mainly relied on underhanded means to subdue his enemies because they were not used to life and death. But it was different here. This was a famous bandit den in the universe, and the domed snow mountain was the fiercest one. He had to observe carefully how the cultivators here fought. The 3 years of protection was crucial to him. He had to make full use of every day. Half a year was the time to collect resources. So, it was time to leave the cave. Just a few days ago, he learned the 4 seasons sword song. He also took the opportunity to go out and buy some materials. This was not his original world. There were no loopholes for him to take advantage of. Other than buying with real money, there was no other way. Looking for insects to supplement his household expenses? Even the germs in this place had been wiped out. Flying all the way, it was quite impressive. The combination of the starlight guiding technique and the Big Dipper Sutra was like pork paired with green onions, or chives paired with eggs. Needless to say, the speed was above average. In fact, with the abilities of these foundation establishment cultivators, even if they cultivated for half a year or a year, they were basically at this level. When it came to choosing an escape technique, who would choose an old ox pulling a broken cart? The key was to go back. Could it keep improving? This was a test of a cultivator's ability, diligence, and talent. For Lu Xiaoyi's starlight traction, the more stars he could sense, the faster it would become. For example, he could only sense the 7 stars of the Big Dipper. With himself as the center, he could only borrow the power of 1 or 2 stars when moving up, down, left, and right. If one day he could sense 100 stars, then no matter which direction he moved, he would be able to borrow power from more than 10 stars. Therefore, his future speed was actually determined by the endurance of his body. Before his body was torn apart, he wanted to see how fast he could go. This was the advantage of being a cultivator of the star system. The problem was that others could not be as close to the stars as he could be. He was now flying towards the southeast. Other than the kinetic energy provided by the normal circulation of his mana, there was also the Merak star in this direction providing him with direct assistance. On the other side, the Dubhe star could also provide him with partial assistance. This was the essence of the starlight traction. It was not the stars that actually provided him with anything, but the help that the stars provided by sensing the corresponding acupoints in the cultivator's body. A cultivator who did not learn anything and only relied on the circulation of his mana could fly in the sky. This was called the flying light board in the cultivation world. It did not add any attributes. When you mastered a special escape technique, such as the strange ones in the Fengmeo Lu, then you would gain a special flying bonus while flying on the flying light board. The better the escape technique, the more it would add. Of course, this was under the premise that the cultivator's cultivation level was stable. Lu Xiaoyi felt that using the starlight traction was about 20% faster than flying on the flying light board. It was not very eye-catching, but do not forget that he had only been practicing the escape technique for 4 to 5 months. As his cultivation level increased and he gained full control over the power of the stars, this ratio would increase until the starlight traction was more effective than flying on the flying light board. There might even be a day when the speed of the starlight traction would be negligible compared to his flying speed on the flying light board. That would be the stage where the starlight traction was fully mastered. However, he might not be able to achieve it in the foundation establishment stage. This was a different matter. The reason why Lu Xiaoyi chose it was because of its uniqueness. There were not many escape techniques that were so special in the Cloud Ao Lu. From what he saw, there were only 2, the shifting of the 5 elements, and the starlight traction. He had no confidence in the arts of the 5 elements. There was no reason for him to give up the easy and go for the difficult. Furthermore, for a swordsman, there was a very unique escape technique, the Imperial Sword Technique. This was another matter altogether. Cultivation was a complex and comprehensive consideration. There was nothing that could be measured by itself. The Big Dipper scripture that increased the cultivation level, the purple star celestial body that strengthened the body, the starlight traction that increased the speed of the escape technique, the astral vision transformation that strengthened the spirit, etc. Only when all these things were combined could a cultivator's true strength be determined. Of course, there was also the crucial sword technique. This was the problem that he wanted to solve this time. Yes, it could not be said that he wanted to solve it. He wanted to try it out. Even if he had doubts about whether the way of the external swordsmanship was suitable for him, it was still just his imagination. It was an obsession in his heart that he could not get rid of. As a rational person, he had to try the external swordsmanship himself before he could make a final judgment. The sword song of the 4 seasons was his touchstone. If he could not solve the doubts in his heart, he would choose another sword technique. In the dome of the snowy peak, there were many cultivators flying on their swords. Most of them were foundation establishment cultivators. They were busy for resources, for missions, for gatherings, for sword duels. Basically, everyone was flying faster than him. Therefore, everyone avoided him. Xianyuan did not have any explicit rules, but there were countless hidden rules. They were all written in the introduction of the sect. For example, if they met in the air, those with a higher cultivation level had to avoid those with a lower cultivation level. Those with a higher cultivation level had to avoid those with a lower cultivation level. Those with a faster speed had to avoid those with a slower speed. What restrained them was not punishment, but pride. Swordsmen would always challenge the strong and disdain the weak. Therefore, when Lu Xiaoyi leisurely flew towards Qianqiu Peak, he was the only one who could fly in a straight line. It was a very embarrassing treatment, but he did not care. Who was not once a baby? Chapter 202. He successfully received the 100 mid-grade spirit stones that belonged to him. Other than that, there was nothing else. He had to rely on these resources to distribute his cultivation. How much to buy, 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 and how much to operate, all belonged to the cultivator's own freedom. No one would interfere. He heard that the Xianyuan sword sect wasn't like this in the past. They also distributed a lot of other things, such as all kinds of medicinal pills, talismans, and even a good quality sword embryo to the swordsman. However, as the Xianyuan sword sect became stronger and stronger, the number of members increased, and the logistical pressure multiplied. As a result, they only distributed spirit stones and left the rest to the market economy of the cultivation world. The results were very good. They saved a lot of management personnel and no longer had to continue with this kind of boring work. They also left a lot of business space for the cultivators, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. No one made things difficult for him. How stupid would a staff member of a sect have to be to embezzle in this kind of open and above-board place? However, his request to see Gu He and Gu Gang in the Ascension Hall was rejected because he couldn't give a convincing reason. Of course, the management of tens of thousands of Foundation establishment cultivators wouldn't waste it on trivial matters. Although Lu Xiaoyi didn't think that Gu Bei's matter was trivial. He also met a few acquaintances. Senior brother cigarette case, senior brother ashtray, I haven't seen you for half a year. I miss you very much. Lu Xiaoyi greeted them from afar. It was almost inevitable that he would bump into them because they entered the sect together. It was just like in his previous life when he received his salary. The usually idle, the sick, and the old would all come out at the same time. Junior brother cigarette, but I trust you've been well since we last met? Are you here to receive relief? Lu Xiaoyi laughed. Yes. There's no overnight food at home. Even a person's fart smells good. Why are there only a few of you here? Where are the other senior brothers and sisters? The few of them chatted for a while before going their separate ways. The few of them had grouped their immortals' caves together, so they traveled together. The others didn't know either. If there were people who liked to gather together for warmth, then there would definitely be people who preferred to be alone. No one could force them. But in his short conversation with them, he obtained an important piece of information. Among the 10 people who came with him, one of them was lucky enough to successfully capture the sword orb and become the enviable swordsman. This person was the only infant mother who came from the same realm as Lu Xiaoyi, Gong Xiaodai. He was a little surprised, but that was all. Could it be that the sword pill was in love with its mother? It had nothing to do with him. He patted the 200 or so mid-grade spirit stones in his storage ring. This was all he had after scrimping and living frugally. Cultivators relied heavily on medicinal pills for cultivation, especially those cultivators who placed their main cultivation techniques in the direction of battle. The reason why they chose cultivation techniques that could increase their battle prowess was because they could supplement it with medicinal pills. This was also a very normal strategy. Because of his personal reasons, he chose the star system cultivation technique. And this cultivation technique, because of his powerful mental strength, was very likely to help him obtain spiritual opportunity that surpassed cultivators of the same realm in the future. Therefore, medicinal pills were not very urgent. Regarding the matter of consuming medicinal pills, he was neither enthusiastic nor averse to it. But since he was tight on money now, there was no need to waste it. He didn't know how much he would have to spend to understand the matter of external swords and flying swords. This was a necessary expenditure that could not be saved. He also hoped that during this process, he would be able to find an external sword technique that was suitable for him. What if he couldn't find it? He never considered this problem. To him, it was as if everything related to the sword was not a problem at all. An inexplicable self-confidence. First of all, the first step was to choose a sword embryo, which was a sword embryo. It meant that it was an unpolished sword without a sword formation engraved on it. It didn't even have an edge. It was a sword embryo that had nothing at all. This kind of thing could only be bought from a specialized shop. In principle, it could not be replaced by a foot-long metal rod in the mortal world. This was because the materials used were completely different. Even the worst sword embryo used by cultivators was forged from cultivator materials. Its value was directly related to the value of the materials used and the number of materials used. A good sword embryo, other than its basic attributes such as hardness and sharpness, also had advantages such as ease of engraving, sensitivity in the transmission of mana, high variability in sword formations, and being suitable for the transmission of mental strength. If an ordinary soldier used cultivator materials to engrave a sword formation on it, the result would basically be the same. The formation would be destroyed and the sword would break. This kind of thing should be left to the professionals. Lu Xiaoyi would not be so idle as to look for materials to refine it himself. Then, he would buy and sell the sword embryo to earn his first bucket of gold. He did not have the economic brain, nor did he seem to have such a golden finger. The only golden finger he had was the ball of luck that was hidden in his sea of consciousness. It was half dead and half alive. It would occasionally work, but most of the time, it was as if it did not exist. There was a market under Qianqiu Peak, and it was the biggest one in Xianyuan. This was because Qianqiu Peak was the main peak of the outer sword. It was also the only place where the outer sword could suppress the inner sword. In the entire Xianyuan, there were 7 or 8 markets, big or small, and the outer sword market was the top 5. There was no other reason. The outer sword had an overwhelming number of people. 90% of the swordsmen were outer swordsmen. It was easy to imagine the strength of the outer sword. Unfortunately, in Xianyuan, quantity did not determine quality. On the contrary, quality dominated quantity. It was very embarrassing. Logically speaking, a proud swordsman would not tolerate this. However, if this person was lost for tens of thousands of years, he would not care. The outer sword was arrogant, but the inner sword was even more arrogant. The outer sword was aggressive, but the inner sword was even more aggressive. It could not be helped. There were 2 brothers born from the same mother. One could spit fire, while the other could only poop. There was no comparison. There were hundreds of shops and hundreds of stalls in the market. There was a dazzling lineup of all kinds of things. Lu Xiaoyi did not even look at the stalls. He went straight to the biggest and most eye-catching shop. He had his own way of buying things. He would not waste his time on picking up scraps from the stalls. This was because he knew his own capabilities. If he spent a lot of time doing this, the chances of him being cheated would be much higher than picking up scraps. It was not worth it. The biggest advantage of doing business here was that there was no need to worry about being robbed or targeted. They were all fellow disciples, and they were all on the same side. If anyone dared to play tricks here, there was no need for professionals to deal with them. These hot-tempered swordsmen could poke holes in people in the market and turn them into thieves. There were not many customers in the market. This was because the timing was not right. Usually, after the big and small sword conventions in Xianyuan, business would be the busiest. This was because there would be a large number of damaged flying swords. The flying swords of a foundation establishment cultivator would not have a sword spirit. Therefore, they could not repair themselves and could only be replaced with new ones. This situation would continue until the Jin Dan realm. Only when a cultivator reached the Yuanying realm would a sword spirit appear in his flying sword. Even if business was slow, no one was in a hurry to attract customers. Lu Xiaoyi was not the only one who hated traveling merchants. In fact, most swordsmen were the same. However, a portion of them were forced by their cultivation and had no choice. Swordsmen worshipped purity. They were not willing to touch anything other than the sword. However, in actual cultivation, how many people could achieve this? Except for those true second-generation cultivators. Lu Shi could not come into contact with these people. He walked to the counter that specialized in selling sword embryos. There were rows and rows of sword embryos. They all looked about the same and were about a foot long. The hilts were almost invisible, and there was no sword case at all. If you insisted that it was a rod, there was nothing wrong with it. Of course, there were very few sword embryos that were the same shape as ordinary long swords. It was just that their proportions were much smaller. He really did not know much about sword embryos. He could not tell whether the materials were good or bad, nor could he tell the refining method. If the Sword Song of Four Seasons did not clearly state the requirements for sword embryos, he would not have had the courage to walk in. He could only walk to the cultivator behind the counter and say, "Senior brother, I want a sword embryo that is balanced with 5 elements. If you really don't have it, you can have a sword embryo with 4 or 3 elements." A cultivator's flying sword would eventually reach equilibrium. However, that was only for high-level cultivators. For a foundation establishment cultivator, the most important thing was its characteristics. It specialized in a certain aspect. For example, the Ice Soul Cold Light Sword focused on the ice element and had outstanding characteristics. The Heavenly Fire Sword focused on the fire element and had obvious advantages. The Heavenly Psychostellar Sword focused on the star element and was very unique. Correspondingly, the Cold Light Sword embryo needed cold jade as its material. The Heavenly Fire Sword embryo needed metal as its main material. The Stellar Sword embryo needed the rare stellar steel. Lu Xiaoyi was experimenting. Of course, it was best to start with the Stellar Sword technique as it was the most compatible. However, stellar steel was very expensive. He could not afford a sword embryo with stellar steel as its main material. This was the reason why he chose the Sword Song of Four Seasons. There were only two possibilities for a foundation establishment cultivator to choose a sword embryo that was balanced with 5 elements. Either they were extremely wealthy and had extraordinary talent. They dared to try to balance the sword body while still in the foundation establishment stage. Either they were extremely poor, or they were greedy for cheap things. This was because there were 2 choices for a sword embryo that was balanced with 5 elements. One was to use 5 different precious materials, metal, wood, water, fire, and earth, to refine it with a special refining method. It was extremely expensive. The other was to find an inert material to replace it. It could adapt to all 5 elements, but each of them would be at a disadvantage. The 5 elements were indeed complete, but all of them were lacking in weight and could not unleash their full power. The surrounding cultivators who were picking out swords all looked over to see which type of cultivator this bragging cultivator belonged to. Chapter 203. Everyone in the Snow Dome Mountain was thinking about how to prove that flying swords worked. Only one person was thinking about how to prove that flying swords didn't work. That was the main reason why he was standing here. 5 elements balanced sword embryo? Yes. And it's the best one in the entire market. Junior brother, you. Before the senior brother could finish, Lu Xiaoyi interrupted him with a dry laugh. Senior brother, I want the cheapest one. The surrounding cultivators who were watching the show couldn't help but shake their heads and smile. They thought he was a king, but it turned out to be a. However, the senior brother who was selling the goods didn't have any mental fluctuations. He had seen this kind of situation many times. It was easy to meet a poor man, but hard to find a king. As a seller standing here, of course he wanted to sell the best goods, so he had to ask. However, he understood the reality even more. For such a young new disciple, the first choice would definitely be price. There was nothing to laugh at, just like when he was a new disciple. Cheap? Yes. My shop is honest and never deceives. We always think from the perspective of our customers. Junior brother, can you tell me what sword technique you are cultivating? This will help me make a choice for you. If you are greedy and can't use it after getting it, it will be awkward. If one bought the best and most expensive sword embryo, no one would ask what sword technique the customer was cultivating. This was because it was obviously the customer's trump card. How could they casually tell others? If one wanted to buy the cheapest one, then it must be because the new disciple was shy in his money, or he was using it for experiments. It didn't matter whether he said it or not, it was not a secret. Lu Xiaoyi liked this. This was the reason why he looked for a big shop. For the same thing, he could find a cheaper one in a small stall, but he couldn't get the service here. Service came with a price, but the price was worth it. This was his philosophy in his previous life. Has senior brother heard of the 4 Seasons sword song? The surrounding cultivators stopped laughing and sighed. There were tens of thousands of sword techniques in the Sword Turtle Tower, and no one could possibly remember the name of every single one of them. However, they would definitely know some of the more famous ones. For example, the one ranked at the top? The one ranked at the bottom? The Sword Turtle Tower's external sword techniques that were carved to the 6th level were already very rare. It was a piece of trash that no one was willing to learn. They were already short on resources. After spending a lot of effort and several years, it ended at the 6th level? Who would be willing? Most swordsmen would choose to use one or a few 7th grade flying swords as their primary weapon. Then, they would prepare 1, 2 8th grade, or even 9th grade flying swords as their trump card based on their wealth. Of course, those who were wealthy would have higher requirements. Level 6 swordsmanship had no value in actual combat, nor was it worth nurturing. If that was the case for level 6 swordsmanship, there was no need to talk about level 5 swordsmanship. What could he do with it? Even if you train to the peak, you will still be at a disadvantage when fighting with others. Therefore, the sword song of the 4 seasons was known by everyone in Xianyuan, but it was a joke. The senior brother sighed. He finally understood that this was a newcomer. It wasn't rare for him to use this sword to explore the path and accumulate experience in sword arrays. However, most people would use a 7th layer flying sword to accumulate experience. After they succeeded, they could still use it. This person, however, was straightforward. It was obvious that he didn't want to use this sword in the future. Since Zhang Xian had already understood the reason behind Zhang Xian's actions, it was easy for him to make a decision. He could forget about earning any spirit stones from Zhang Xian and send him away as soon as possible. When he saw Zhang Xian, he was reminded of the difficulties he had faced at the start, and his mood immediately soured. Understood. I have it. The senior brother who had everything pulled out a box from under the counter. Inside there was a mess of flying swords that didn't look too good. He flipped through the box and picked one out. Meteoric iron sword. It doesn't contain any attributes of the 5 elements, so it can be used in any sword array. However, it doesn't increase any attributes and even has a discount. It's best to use it for experiments and accumulate experience. It's not a pity to throw it away. This thing has been here for many years. It's not because it's defective, but because there are too few people who use it. It's a pity to melt it, but it's useless to keep it. If junior brother wants to use it, I'll give you a discount. 10 mid-grade spirit stones, the lowest price. What do you think, junior brother? None of the flying swords on the counter were worth less than 100 spirit stones. Relatively speaking, 10 spirit stones was already the lowest price. However, to Lu Xiaoyi, who had experience using low-grade spirit stones to trade in his previous world, the price level in the 5th ring cultivation world was still very high. He could only accept it. The other party had good intentions. Since the store was emptied, he would benefit from it. Thus, he didn't bother the other party. Give me 1 set of each of the basic materials for engraving the 5 elements. And I don't need good ones, as long as they can be used. The senior brother directly began to take out the materials. Cheap. Is that what you mean? This kind of flying sword can only be used with the cheapest materials. However, 5 sets may not be enough. It's your first time engraving, so it's inevitable that there will be some mistakes in the process. Don't tell me you'll have to buy materials again if you make a mistake? There's a discount for wholesale. I'll charge you 30 mid-grade spirit stones for 10 sets of materials, so it'll be 40 mid-grade spirit stones in total. I can't guarantee that my price is the lowest in this market, but I can guarantee that my materials are the real deal. What do you say? Lu Xiaoyi straightforwardly took out the spirit stones. The senior brother was very satisfied. In this line of work, what they hated the most were those who were greedy after taking advantage of others. They didn't want to give up, they wanted a yard after taking an inch, and they chattered endlessly. Thus, he said a few more words. Find a piece of ordinary iron and melt copper on it to engrave the sword array. After a few more times, you'll naturally be familiar with the sword array engraving. This was all based on his experience. It was not recorded in the cultivation technique, but it could effectively reduce the probability of failure, which also meant that he could save on the cost of materials. Generally, people like him who sold goods would not tell customers these things. If you failed too many times, you would naturally come to him to buy goods. If he said this, he would be cutting off his own business. This was also because of this new disciple's clear-cut attitude. Lu Xiaoyi thought for a moment. Senior brother, do you have a sword with you? A sword with a sword was a normal handheld sword. It was also a cultivator's last resort for self-defense. Because the sword shape was elegant, more than half of the cultivators would have a sword with them. This was especially true for swordsmen. Everyone had one, and it was for personal protection. The sword that Lu Xi had always been using was Liang Quangren's sword. It was very useful in his original world, but in a place like the Fifth Ring, it would be vulnerable. The materials were not up to par, and the refinement was very rough. This was the difference between the upper and lower realms. He didn't want to lose his weapon in a sword fight, so he had to prepare a good one. Of course. We have it. The senior brother did not hesitate. He was not lying. In their line of work, although sword with a sword did not sell as fast as flying swords, it was still a big trend. Tens of thousands of foundation establishment cultivators each had a sword, so the market was very big. Or a cheap one? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. It's the best. Chapter 204. A senior brother laughed. This newcomer was not stupid. He knew what could be bought cheaply, and what must be bought well. A sword was a cultivator's last weapon. Of course, it could not be neglected. Even if it could not be used freely, it should at least be able to withstand the attacks of others. It could not be used casually. Attribute? Characteristics? Do you have any special requirements? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. Hard. Sturdy. The rest does not matter. A senior brother understood a little. It turned out that this junior brother liked to fight in close combat. Different cultivators had different requirements for their swords. Many people like swords with attributes. For example, a long sword forged with fire attribute materials. If used together with fire attribute techniques, the effect would be greatly increased. When waved, flames would surround the body, and it would have a certain spell effect. But there were also many people who liked to rely purely on sword skills and sword chi to support their close combat system. These were two different directions. There was no difference in superiority or inferiority. They just had different preferences. With attributes, one would lose speed. If one pursued sword speed, one would have to give up on spells. It was that simple. There is a sword called long sword. In terms of firmness, not to mention in this shop, it is unique in the entire market. It is forged with selected black gold. Every time it is layered, special materials will be added. It is formed by 12 layers. The method of picking black gold is excellent in both toughness and hardness. 100 mid-grade spirit stones, no bargaining. Once again, he opened a hidden box on the counter. But this time, it was not a hodgepodge of trash like last time. Instead, it was a rather exquisite sword box. He took out a long sword and handed it over. Lu Xiaoyi took the sword in his hand and felt an indescribable sharp aura. He was not an expert in sword forging, but he believed in his intuition. This was a good sword. With a wave of his hand, light and shadow swayed. There was only an afterimage and no sound of the sword. It is a good sword, Lu Xi echoed. A senior brother laughed at himself. His shop had never sold shoddy materials, which was why there was today's situation. Black gold was a very common material in the cultivation world. Like this ordinary sword-shaped thing, no one would use high-grade materials to make it. If it was made with precious materials like the flying sword, no one would be able to afford it. The key was in the forging method and the special materials added. This was where the sword's value lay. You have good taste. I take back my previous opinion of your choice of swordsmanship being brainless. As an apology, and also as a reward for the customer, I'll give you a flying sword case. By the time Lu Xiaoyi walked out of the shop, his net worth had already shrunk by more than half. Everyone had their own shopping habits. Some people like to compare in every possible way when shopping, picking and choosing, and derive pleasure from it. He was the exact opposite. He liked to do it all at once, saving time and worry. Do you think you can find the best price-performance ratio just by comparing the goods? Not ever! Because the essence of this shopping method was to never be satisfied, he did not want to put his mood on such meaningless dissatisfaction. What he wasn't satisfied with was other things. He added some small parts, and before he ran out of spirit stones in his pocket, he embarked on his return journey. Shopping was indeed enjoyable, but that was only for those who had a lot of money in their pockets. For a foreign visitor like him who had no foundation, even if he came here once a year, the more he bought, the more sullen he felt. He was not an ascetic. After 3 years, he would find something to do, the kind that would make him rich quickly. The icy river rolled down. Lu Xiaoyi had already adapted to this kind of noise. He found that it was more challenging and effective to train his 6 senses in the noise. When he saw this world in the future, it would never be a relatively simple environment. There would always be various kinds of complicated situations, where countless divine senses intersected, all kinds of sounds mixed, and all kinds of smells mixed. He would have to distinguish what he really needed from among them. There were too many things to pay attention to, but the most important thing now was that after several days of preparation, under the advice of a senior brother, he had already used up the iron copper. It was so that he could familiarize himself with the feeling of using his energy to inscribe sword formations on the weapons. As a dignified swordsman, he did not practice swordsmanship by controlling the sword. Instead, he spent his time inscribing sword formations, which made him speechless. In his mind, practicing swordsmanship should be the kind of improvement in the control of the flying sword after thousands of times of controlling the flying sword, not hiding in the cave and scribbling on the sword, hoping to inscribe one more layer of sword formations, one more layer. Even if this kind of improvement would be more direct, faster, and more fulfilling. Placing the slightly ugly flying sword in front of him, Lu Xiaoyi recalled the form of the sword formation he was going to inscribe this time. This was a flying sword formation of the water element, which was also the easiest type for a flying sword. The most important thing in inscribing sword formations was to pay attention to the smoothness of flowing water, without any stumbling in the middle. Only then could the sword formation be fully unleashed. To achieve this, there were a few aspects. Whether the magical energy was always sufficient and evenly distributed, whether the sword formation was familiar with the sword formation itself, whether there were any external disturbances, etc. Of course, when a true expert inscribed sword formations, it was a kind of random thing. Maybe they had something in mind, maybe they were drunk, or maybe they were in high spirits. When the time came, they would not pay attention to the distribution of magical energy, but would do as they pleased, incorporating their personal understanding of the great Tao into the formation. This kind of state was too far away from Lu Xiaoyi, so far that he could not even see it. Relying on the tens of repetitions from before, Lu Xiaoyi completed the first inscribing without any mishaps. He succeeded. It was not that he was talented in inscribing sword formations, but because this was the simplest sword formation. If all the foundational cultivators in the dome were to use it as practice when they first entered the sect, there would not be many who would fail. Another very important reason was that there was nothing on the sword embryo, which was equivalent to inscribing on a blank space. This made the difficulty much lower. Only when inscribing the second layer of the sword formation would a cultivator's ability be tested, because he had to avoid damaging the first layer of the sword formation. The flying sword could no longer be called a sword embryo. It was now a real flying sword, even though it was still in its initial stages. Lu Xiaoyi channeled his magical energy into it, and under the guidance of his consciousness, the flying sword trembled and floated up slightly. It jumped diagonally and slapped horizontally into a pile of snow a few feet away, disappearing without a trace. The first sword, a perfect failure. There were many things that needed to be coordinated, such as the strength of the magical energy, the control of the sword formation, the adjustment and control of the soul. This was not like throwing the sword formation into the sky and the flying sword would automatically complete the rest of the attack. It was like a magical item, which required countless times of familiarity to be able to control and release at will, to the extent of the sword's will. This was a process that every swordsman had to go through, especially at the beginning, when they were completely clueless. It was like a beginner driving, with the accelerator, brake, and steering wheel in a mess, wishing that they had a few more hands and legs. At this point, he had mastered all the secret techniques from the Bo-Ao Tower. The only problem left was how to go deeper. This would determine how he would get out of the protection period 2 years later. Would he go down the dome with his ultimate skills, or would he look at the world with his naked eyes? Chapter 205. His schedule was very full. If he wanted to live comfortably in the future, starting was very important. His reincarnation was already a big step behind others. If he didn't work hard, he was afraid that he wouldn't even be able to live as a rice worm. Because his cultivation methods and secret techniques were all of the star system, his cultivation efficiency was very high. He basically didn't have to sit cross-legged and cultivate a fixed type of cultivation method. When he cultivated the Big Dipper star scripture at dawn, he had to use the starlight guidance at the same time, flying while guiding the spiritual energy into his body. This had already become a habit, and it had already started since the Gobi Desert. When he cultivated the purple star celestial body, he would also put the celestial vision transformation together, striving to improve his physical body and spirit at the same time. This was the greatest use of the star system's resources, because if he did it step by step, he wouldn't be able to catch up with his peers. One day in the future, he also wanted to cultivate these 4-star system cultivation methods at the same time, so that he could achieve a perfect combination of cultivation, spirit, body, and escape technique. If he mixed it into his swordsmanship, it would basically be a low-intensity battle. He was very clear about the benefits of doing so. For many cultivators, they completely separated cultivation and combat. When they cultivated, they focused on cultivation, and when they fought, they focused on fighting. The result of doing so was very likely that they would not be able to display their full strength in battle. Liu Xiaoyi had a natural instinct for battle, even if he didn't realize it. This could be seen from how he was able to stand out in his original world, and how he continuously killed strong enemies. However, these achievements didn't give him the confidence to establish a foothold in the 5th ring. He was still watching carefully, afraid that he would be killed in this bandit's nest. In a month's time, he worked hard on the flying sword, and was basically able to completely use the full power of the first layer of the flying sword. Now, he was ready to start recording the second layer. Unfortunately, his first attempt failed unexpectedly. The only good news was that he didn't destroy the first layer of the sword array. He felt that he should take a break, relax, and casually find the reason for his failure. On this day, Liu Xiaoyi left the cave and flew east. Ling Ruofeng sent him a sword message saying that there was a small gathering and asked if he was interested in attending. This was the contact information they had left behind after their last meeting. Even if their relationship was weak, as an adult cultivator, most of them knew how to maintain a good relationship with each other. Liu Xiaoyi was not keen on this, but he knew that he had to go. The worst way to cultivate was to stay in the cave and study by himself, without hearing anything outside the cave. He would trap himself in the cultivation world he had built, thinking that if he stayed in seclusion for more than 10 years, the world would know about his sword. How could an individual's knowledge of swordsmanship compare to that of tens of thousands of people outside? And tens of thousands of years of history? Therefore, even though Liu Xiaoyi was very persistent in his understanding of swordsmanship, he also understood the importance of communication. Although he didn't have much combat power with his flying sword, he could still watch others fight, right? Among the 60 people on the floating raft, only 10 of them were arranged to stay in the Xianyuan sword sect under the dome. Other than the little butterfly from the Golden Phoenix Palace who flew out of the chicken coop, the other 9 were complete weaklings. Among these people, a few chose to stay together when they set up their cave, hoping to rely on the strength of a group to fight against this cruel cultivation world. A few others chose to fly solo, including Lu Xiaoyi. This group was also the only one in the dome that would remember to inform him when they gathered. If Gu Bei was still alive, he might have another group to join, but now, this was the only one. In Lu Xiaoyi's mind, this was the story of a few sheep who had just arrived in a new world, discussing how to unite together to fight against the tigers, leopards, jackals, and wolves around them. The distance between their cave residences was close to 1,000 li. With Lu Xiaoyi's starlight traction technique, it took him more than 4 hours to fly such a distance. If converted, it was roughly equivalent to 120 kilometers per hour in his previous life. It was already close to the speed of a speeding car. But in the cultivation world, he was just a snail. Every cultivator he saw was in the state of flying swords, and their speed was at least twice as fast as his. If it wasn't for the conspicuous sword case on his back, who knew how many swordsmen would have stopped to ask him why he used other escape techniques instead of flying swords in the dome? Were they spies sent by him? Even with the sword case shielding him from most of the questioning, he was still stopped by a dignified middle-aged Taoist. That Taoist's eyes were fierce, and he was imposing without being angry. Why didn't I fly swords in the holy land of the sword vein? Why did you learn the habits of the Dharma vein and pursue a carefree temperament? Did you enter the sword sect to play with elegance? Lu Xiaoyi was speechless when he met such a meddlesome person. He knew very well that in the Xianyuan sword sect, it was an unspoken rule to only use one escape technique, the sword manipulation technique, for a lifetime. Although it wasn't explicitly stated in the history books, it was mentioned too many times that a certain ancestor would only fly swords for his entire life, without any escape techniques or mounts. It was actually a hidden hint, and was regarded as the golden rule by the extremists in the sword vein. It was also the symbol of a pure swordsman. He didn't understand. Was he playing with elegance, or were the swordsmen playing with temperament? Was it necessary to fly swords 1,000 times the same? Why couldn't it be more comfortable? Hence, he shook the sword case, and a flying sword flew out. It circled and turned, and it had a powerful aura. Of course, this was in the eyes of an outsider. The middle-aged swordsman knew what was going on as soon as he saw the sword. A new disciple's flying sword had yet to reach a certain level. Generally speaking, in order to learn the sword manipulation technique, the flying sword itself had to be able to carry a certain amount of weight. If it was converted to the number of engravings, it would be able to carry around 3 layers. However, it was obvious that a flying sword with only 1 layer engraved would not be able to perform the sword manipulation technique. The middle-aged swordsman snorted and turned to leave. Lu Xiaoyi, on the other hand, continued to wobble. To be honest, although it was guided by the starlight, its flying posture was indeed very elegant, because it was flying upright. With his hands behind his back and his sleeves fluttering in the wind, it didn't seem like he was using any strength at all. It was as if he was a real immortal, playing with the mortal world. Its kinetic energy came from the surge of mana under the guidance of the starlight. Therefore, even if he were to run for his life in the future, he would still fly in the same manner. The swordsman's sword manipulation technique was different, especially the sword manipulation technique of the Foundation Establishment external sword. It required the user to lean forward, which was in accordance with the theory of fluid dynamics. However, it was obvious that the user was using all his strength. It was similar to the starting motion of a sprinter in his previous life. It looked very iron-blooded, but it was not as elegant as other escape techniques, especially the Taoist ones. This was the reason why the middle-aged swordsman didn't like him. In fact, many people didn't like him, but there weren't many people who would meddle in his business. Lu Xiaoyi didn't care. Chapter 206. The place where cigarette case and the rest gathered was a ring-shaped mountain. Outside the ring-shaped mountain, it was covered in white snow. Inside the ring-shaped mountain, it was like spring all year round. It was a pretty good place. When he arrived at the ring-shaped mountain, he realized that all 10 of his former companions had gathered, except for the infant mother, Gong Xiaodai. "Didn't you call cigarette case? I haven't seen him for half a year. I really want to see the splendor of the so-called inner sword. What's the difference between him and us losers?" Lu Xiaoi laughed. The person in charge of organizing this gathering was cigarette case, Ling Ruofeng. This was also his habit. He liked to take the lead in everything. With his strength, it was impossible for him to establish a separate circle. Therefore, he could only pull in his former companions. "He's an inner sword now. He's different from us. She might not come even if we call him. It'll be awkward if he comes. Cigarette, but can you not call him by his Dharma name the moment we meet? We're so familiar with each other. Isn't it more intimate to call him by his name?" Lu Xiaoi nodded. "Calling him by his name is good. Calling him by his name is good." Ling Ruofeng led him into the valley. Immediately, the scenery changed. After familiarizing himself with the white snow, it was indeed the style of a cultivator to have such a green environment to change his mood. In an empty space, someone had set up a stall to barbecue food. There was a sumptuous spread of fruits and wine. It was obvious that it had been meticulously prepared. Lu Xiaoi felt that something was amiss. "Are there any guests coming?" Ling Ruofeng nodded. "It's mainly us. I've also invited a few senior brothers and seniors. They're experts with great strength in the outer sword lineage. Firstly, it's to make more friends. Secondly, it's to see how outer swordsmen fight. We're new here and are clueless. It's useless to train hard in the cave abode." Lu Xiaoi sighed in admiration. "Senior brother Ling, you're so thorough. You've made new friends, but you haven't forgotten your old friends." Although he said that, he knew that things weren't that simple. There was always something fishy going on. He couldn't be bothered to guess. There was bound to be a clue. The guests had arrived earlier than expected. Or rather, Lu Xiaoi was too slow and arrived a little late. Therefore, the 3 external swordsmen had arrived together with him. Ling Ruofeng introduced them enthusiastically. "This is Senior Brother Guanggu, Senior Brother Yan Qing, and Senior Brother Yan Hua. Today, they took the time out of their busy schedules to attend our gathering and give us pointers on cultivation. It's truly our honor." Everyone treated him with respect, and the 3 senior brothers also returned the courtesy sincerely, without the slightest trace of impatience or arrogance. Guanggu was from the Guang generation, which meant that he had entered the sect at least 50 years earlier than them. Although the other 2 were also from the Yan generation, looking at their demeanor, they were also veterans who had been in the dome for decades. Naturally, their demeanor was different. Here, no one was overbearing at first sight, and no one was inexplicably arrogant. They were all cultured people. It didn't make sense that mortals could cultivate their body and mind by writing and painting for more than 10 years. Cultivators, on the other hand, had cultivated for longer periods of time, yet they were vulgar and unsophisticated. Everyone drank wine, ate meat, and drank tea. They each took their own pleasure. This kind of occasion was different from a private gathering of good friends. No one would shout and respect each other, and no one would be crazy drunk. The banquet was just a way to cover up the awkwardness. For example, if you didn't want to talk, you could bury your head in eating and drinking. Lu Xiaoi didn't know what to say because the most discussed topic was swordsmanship. In this aspect, he was incompatible with the people present. He didn't want to argue because he understood that in the current situation of Xianyuan, they were the mainstream and orthodox. This was something that had been proven through the rise and fall of sects for tens of thousands of years. If he really wanted to prove his point of view, he didn't need to say it. When he had a place in the Sword or a Rushing to Heaven pavilion one day, there would naturally be people who would learn from him. When he dominated the external swordsmanship, his swordsmanship would be the orthodox way. What's more, He didn't want to prove anything. He had a lot of secrets on him. Was it about the interception of luck? Was it about his own origin? Was it about his almost instinctive obsession with swordsmanship? His thoughts were very likely to belong only to himself, and not a universal truth that could be placed on top of the dome. However, he still pricked up his ears and learned from the exchange of swordsmanship with this group of people, especially the three senior brothers. Xianyuan had a very good habit. He rarely hit anything in his exchanges. This was actually a process of mutual improvement, not only for the listeners, but also for the preacher. Humans were a very strange race. If you let them think by themselves, they might not be able to come up with anything. However, if you let them face a group of admiring admirers, especially if there were a few beautiful female cultivators among them, they would immediately talk nonstop. Their ideas would flow like a fountain. The things that he didn't quite understand before were now clear, and the things that he was hesitant about were now confirmed. What a wonderful power! Xianyuan's swordsmen had more males than females, and it was completely out of proportion. This was also the reason why the entertainment centers around the dome were so developed. Many swordsmen preferred this kind of solution, especially those who were firm in their pursuit of the Tao. Lu Xiaoyi had always been very curious about Xuanyuan's abnormal behavior. Why didn't the higher-ups restrict it? Logically speaking, with Xuanyuan's position in the Five Rings, there shouldn't be a lack of suitable Tao companions. While the others were talking, he was thinking about it. Even so, he still heard something different from the words of the old cultivators. The most important thing was that these three senior brothers also came from outside the universe. Just like them, they were all abducted. This was more like an alliance without a home. Halfway through the wine, senior brother Yanqing was in high spirits. He took out his flying sword and let everyone have a taste of the sword power of a mature external sword cultivator. Yanqing cultivated the wind and thunder sword. 8 layers of sword formations were engraved. Was this his strongest flying sword, or just one of the commonly used ones? P.S. Today's update is 10. Thank you for your support. Please subscribe and vote. The new book is new and needs everyone's help. Please read the book at the starting point. This way, when Sloth eats noodles, he may add an extra egg. Other people's privacy wasn't important. What was important was that many things could be seen from the flying sword's movement. The maximum distance was 2,000 feet. The maximum speed couldn't be accurately measured, but it definitely wouldn't exceed the speed of sound. As for the power, the heavy bluestone could easily destroy the sword. If it pierced a person's body, even a foundation establishment cultivator wouldn't be able to withstand it. Of course, it also depended on the specific defense methods and whether talismans were used to create a defensive circle. The advancement of body cultivation techniques was like a battle between a spear and a shield. It couldn't be compared purely. In comparison, Lu Xiaoyi's flying sword's effective range was only 500 feet. Its speed wasn't enough. The sword could be seen clearly with the naked eye, which meant that he had enough time to dodge. As for the power, the tree could penetrate it, but the bluestone could only penetrate 3 inches. The gap was huge. This was an unavoidable reality. He had only been in the foundation establishment stage for 4 years. During that time, he had drifted in the deep space of the universe for 3 years. It had been less than a year since he entered Xianyuan and obtained the superior techniques. He couldn't compare with the senior swordsman who had been cultivating for decades. This was a good thing. At least he knew how big the gap was between him and the others. Only then could he have a target to compare himself with. He reckoned that these 3 senior brothers were not the best in the outer Xianyuan sword group. Otherwise, they wouldn't have shown up at this level of gathering. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. The thought of a rice worm was rising again. It wasn't easy to compete with them. Chapter 207. Yan Chan was the first to attack, followed by Yanhua, and finally Guanggu. For a moment, the small valley was filled with sword lights and whistling sounds. Riding my Xianyuan sword, sweeping away the world's sorrow, waking up like a dream, spreading my name everywhere, Guanggu's senior brother chanted, resonating with the sound of the swords. He then invited the cultivators who were watching from the side. Why are you all standing there as spectators? My Xianyuan sword, and song together should be in harmony with each other. This group of people was originally too embarrassed to use their swords. The difference between them and the other party was too great. Using their own strength would only make them laugh, so it was better to be clumsy. However, since Guanggu had invited them, and it was not a solemn occasion, they were not competing in terms of face. Being secretive would make them look inferior. Thus, all the swords attacked together, surging and rippling in the valley. When all the swords were used, there were people who immediately showed their cowardice and made a fool of themselves. The 3 leading flying swords were as vigorous as dragons in the front, while the other 9 flying swords followed them in a staggering manner. Even though the flying swords in front were deliberately slowing down, they were still barely able to keep up. Finally, there was still a flying sword that was crawling behind them, but it was not doing so neatly. It was as if it was drunk from the wake of the flying swords in front of it, making people worry that it might fall down at any time. Lu Xiaoyi also did not want to embarrass himself in this kind of situation. Although he was thick-skinned enough, it was worse not to use his sword in this kind of situation. Either he would embarrass himself, or he would give the impression that he was looking down on others. How should he choose? If he had the strength, he would choose the former. But now, if he embarrassed himself, then so be it. Who had not embarrassed themselves before? No one mocked him, and no one looked at him with contempt, even if his performance was not on the same level as these senior brothers who had entered the sect at the same time. Among them, the lowest level flying sword had covered 3 layers of sword array, while Sima Wan had covered 5 layers. Of course, it could not be compared to Lu Xiaoyi's flying sword. Even the 3 senior apprentice brothers in the lead deliberately lowered their speed again, showing a collective attitude, afraid that the flying sword would not be able to keep up, and cause chaos in the sword chi formation again and fall down. In the end, the demonstration of flying swords came to a successful end. From the goal of evolving a certain sword formation to the minimum requirement of not missing a single sword formation. This made the 3 seniors heave a sigh of relief. Otherwise, today's matter would be a joke if it were to spread out. The 3 of them looked at each other, and roughly judged the strength of this new batch of disciples. To be honest, they were not bad. To be able to successfully build a foundation on a low-level cultivation planet, there must be something extraordinary about them. Almost every one of them had passed the average level of sword carving during their cultivation time. The more outstanding ones had even reached the 4th or 5th level. This was not only a matter of carving array techniques, but also an accurate measure of a cultivator's overall strength, cultivation, spirit, and understanding of the sword. It was very normal, except for one who was particularly bad. In a nest of Calabash brothers, there was bound to be a crooked melon. It was as if nothing had happened. The swordsmen displayed their personal qualities to the fullest, to the point that Lu Xiaoyi did not even have the chance to mock himself. Nothing could make him feel more embarrassed than this. Everyone continued to drink and chat, and Sima Wan asked a question. Senior brothers! Ever since I started practicing the sword, I have deeply felt that the sharpness of the external sword is invincible. It is the great way of the sword. In the future, with this skill, I can go anywhere in the world. But I don't know why in Xianyuan, the external sword is 10 times more powerful than the internal sword? Among our companions there is a Gong Xiaodai. After entering the internal sword there has been no news of her, as if she had disappeared into thin air. We have asked people to bring her a message several times, but she never returned. Is she looking down on us now that she has ascended to a higher position? His question was true, but the one who asked people to bring the message was not him, but another one of his companions who had a good relationship with him. He probably liked the infant mother, so he wanted to contact her. However, the message was like a stone thrown into the sea, and there was not even a reply. For swordsmen in the Foundation establishment stage, the internal sword and external sword cave areas were not the same, so they could not rashly barge in. As a cultivator, it was very impolite to search someone's cave without their permission. The three old swordsmen looked at each other and smiled bitterly. In the end, the oldest one, Guanggu, answered, "We don't know why they didn't reply, but the internal sword is not that mysterious. Cultivators like us also have their own time to relax. Not every internal sword cultivator is bitterly disciplined. But when it comes to sword skills, it is probably true. The strength of the internal sword is not something we external sword cultivators can compare to. You don't know, but the internal and external sword cultivators in Xianyuan have been fighting for 10,000 years since Xianyuan was founded. At that time, there were two opposing schools in Xianyuan. One was the internal sword cultivator and the external sword cultivator, and the other was the master, disciple, and clan cultivator. In the end, this situation slowly disappeared after a peerless figure appeared in the internal sword. The opposition was no longer there. In the past 20,000 years, the situation in Xianyuan has changed again, and there is a new opposition. Everyone was puzzled. Who is it? Which generation is it? The external sword cultivator was subdued just like that. Guanggu sighed. This was the disgrace of the external sword cultivator in Xuanyuan's history. But in any case, they were from the same family. It was better than losing face in the outside world. With his experience, he could show off in front of these new disciples. But in reality, he had only read more about the history of the sect and heard more about it. How could an old Foundation establishment cultivator like him know the real inside story? Who is it? This is the secret of the sect. Unless you are in Yuanying, you can't know everything. What I know is that ever since that ancestor was born, the internal sword cultivator in Xianyuan completely suppressed the external sword cultivator and became a vassal. At the same time, the clan cultivator fell from power. The current Xianyuan is dominated by the internal sword cultivator and supplemented by the external sword cultivator. This is an indisputable fact. In the future, when you meet internal sword cultivators, you don't have to be servile. Just maintain normal manners. If they bully you, there will be internal sword cultivators to deal with them. If you are interested in comparing notes with internal sword cultivators, it's not impossible. But you must find a good host and compete in a proper place. Otherwise, it will be dangerous, and it won't be good for you or others. Ling Ruofeng asked. Senior Marshal Brother, how are they strong? There has to be a direct comparison, right? We can't be inferior to them just because they are internal sword cultivators, right? The newborn calf wasn't afraid of the tiger. Looking at the eager eyes, Guanggu couldn't refuse. When he was in Chura's sect, he also had the same idea. There wasn't much difference, but the future would teach them a lot. I'll just say it briefly. You can compare among yourselves. The internal sword cultivators who are at the same cultivation level as me are not as good as me in terms of the flying sword range. My maximum range is 3,000 feet, but they may only be 2,000 feet away. This is the maximum range. In fact, it is meaningless in a battle because both sides are moving quickly. There is another kind of effective distance. It is the distance that the soul can control. Under complete control of the flying sword can fully display its combat power. In this distance, the internal sword is still 2,000 feet, but my external sword is reduced to 1,500 feet. There is only one difference. When both sides meet, he will have the initiative, not me. In the battle of swordsmen, the initiative comes first. If we lose the initiative, we can only passively defend. I don't need to tell you what it means for us. This is the beginning of a bad game. Chapter 208. Sima Wan was puzzled. Why? Why is it that the inner sword's range of control is further than my outer swords? Yanqing sighed. Because their flying swords are formless and intangible. On the other hand, we have both form and quality. The gap between us is so big that it's insurmountable. It's also because of this that our sword's speed is slightly slower than the inner sword's. The most important thing is that their flying swords don't have any cost. They're just metal essence scraped off from the sword orb, endless and unending. How many flying swords do we have? They make a move first, fly faster, and attack more than us. Our outer sword's power is above theirs. If both sides meet and have the same cultivation level, how do you think we should fight? Everyone was silent, but in the hearts of the newcomers, 9 out of 10 of them were unconvinced. This was also a characteristic of cultivators, especially sword cultivators. No matter what others said, they would only know after fighting once. Only after fighting a few times would they become the likes of Guanggu. Only Lu Shi sighed inwardly. His judgment was correct. If he followed the path of the outer sword, he wouldn't be able to win against those rich and overbearing cultivators. On top of that, there was the inner sword system. He could forget about standing out in Xianyuan for the rest of his life. He didn't want to be in the limelight, but what if there was an inner sword cultivator who also had a shard of destiny like him? What would he do? It had been 16 years since the shard of destiny scattered into the universe. If there was a 5th ring cultivator who had a shard of destiny, they would be on the same level as him. In fact, all the shards of destiny in the universe should be on the same level as him, right? If a high-level cultivator had a shard of destiny, then there was no need for others to play. They would only end up being devoured. The gathering only ended after 4 hours. The 3 senior apprentice brothers even gave everyone a small gift. Everyone received an exquisite jade pendant. It wasn't a magic tool, but more like a symbol of status, a keepsake of some organization. Only Lu Xiaoyu received something substantial. 10 mid-grade spirit stones. This was a happy ending. Following the departure of the 3 senior apprentice brothers, those who weren't here also left. Ling Ruofeng called out to him. Disappointed? Do you think they look down on you? Lu Xiaoyu placed the spirit stones into his storage ring with an indifferent expression on his face. One of the good things about me is that I don't compare myself to others. Senior martial brothers of the 3 senior martial brothers are concerned about me, a junior, so they gave me some spirit stones. I can't bear a grudge just because it's different from what others give me. Instead, he was filled with the anger of the vicissitudes of life. This is not the way to conduct oneself. I'm guessing that you've obtained some sort of token from a small group, right? Does the Xianyuan Sword School allow such an existence? Ling Ruofeng admired Lu Xiaoyu's attitude and felt that he could talk to him more. Little E, I know that your ambition is not to cultivate the sword, but to cultivate magic. However, listen to my advice. Since you are already here, take things as they come. Since you can't leave the dome, there is no need to insist on your own views. Even if you reach a higher state in the future, it won't be too late to talk about magic. I heard that there is no ban on magic in Xianyuan, especially defensive magic and talismans. But the prerequisite is that you have to have some achievements in swordsmanship. You don't need me to teach you the trade-off, do you? Lu Xiaoyu smiled and said, Thank you for your advice, Senior Martial Brother Ling. I understand. It's just that I started a little late on the path of swordsmanship, and I have a lot of questions, so I slowed down my progress. It's only been half a year. To a cultivator, this is nothing. Ling Ruofeng saw that he didn't seem to be lying, so he relaxed and explained. Of course, Xianyuan doesn't allow different organizations to exist within the school. However, that token is not a token of an organization, but a token of a loan. A token of a loan? What do you mean? Lu Xiaoyu felt that it was a novelty. Ling Ruofeng sighed and said, Everywhere there is Jianghu, and everywhere there are factions. It's the same for the realm, the country, and of course it's the same for the school. Just as Senior Martial Brother Guanggu said, in the early days of Xianyuan, there were internal and external sword vein conflicts, and there were conflicts between master and disciple clans. Although these conflicts are no longer the mainstream now is other conflicts. For example, the conflict of birthplace. Seeing that Lu Xiaoyi seemed to understand something, he nodded and said, "You see, you understand as soon as I say it. The origins of Xuanyuan's disciples are complicated, but their origins can be divided into 3 groups. Xuanyuan's ancestral land, the aboriginals of the Fifth Ring Road, and those of us who were abducted. After 10,000 years, the status of us wandering souls in Xianyuan has gradually increased, and we now account for nearly 30% of the high-level cultivators. This is a huge improvement, but of course, it also brings with it a huge challenge. This token is a good deed done by some high-level foreign cultivators among the Foundation establishment cultivators. Because they know that many of us will be trapped in a lack of resources, have no one to rely on, and have no place to borrow strength, they set up a large spirit stone trading company, and specialize in borrowing from us outsiders to satisfy the cultivators' needs in the process of cultivation. After all, resources have to be distributed every 6 months, and some cultivators can have to wait for half a year, right? If there's an urgent need, you can borrow with this token. There are different levels of borrowing, and the more trustworthy and powerful you are, the more you can borrow. For newcomers like us, the upper limit is 200 mid-grade spirit stones, but it's enough for a temporary turnover. Little E, you're a bit slow to learn the basics of swordsmanship, so the 3 senior brothers didn't give you the token. But it's not a big deal. Once you've mastered the flying sword and have enough strength, they won't be short of you. This is a benefit for us outsiders, and it doesn't require interest, so it'll be much more convenient with it." Lu Xiaoyi sighed. "It can't be that there's no interest at all, right? If there's no interest on spirit stones, I'm afraid we'll have to find other ways to make up for it." Ling Ruofeng didn't care. "Yes, people have to do something. If it's not this, it's that. Who can stay in the domed cave forever? It's nothing more than some requests to help each other. It's very reasonable, and even the sect didn't stop it." Lu Xiaoyi didn't continue to argue. There was no need. This kind of spirit stone borrowing that could only be done by cultivators from specific areas, even if there were no conditions attached, would have an impact on the cultivators' thinking after a long time. There were small groups everywhere, and this was human nature. Cultivators would automatically gather together due to various factors. Where did they come from? What dialect did they speak? What cultivation method did they practice? What hobbies did they have? And so on and so forth. So there were alchemist associations, talisman master alliances, and array master groups. Some were for communication and improvement, some were for transfer of benefits, and some were for fighting. But Lu Xiaoyi didn't like this kind of purely good-natured borrowing method. He preferred the kind with interest. Both sides had their own demands, and this was the way to long-term cooperation. Otherwise, like now, it was as if he owed someone a favor at any time, and he didn't know what kind of method the other party would use to ask for his help and support. Would you do it or not? He didn't believe in purely good-natured borrowing. Even if this was the original intention of the lending organization, as time passed, there would be changes in the people who carried it out. He didn't like this method. It was good that they didn't give him the token, and it would save him the embarrassment of not knowing how to return it. Chapter 209. Lu Xiaoyi already felt a sense of urgency. He knew that the longer he stayed in Xianyuan, the more people he came into contact with, the more trouble he would encounter. He had to strengthen himself. Even if he didn't look down on the heroes, he had to at least let others feel that he was not to be trifled with. A year later, he had to go to the market to buy another set of materials and sword embryos. Not only did he use up all the materials for the previous set, even the sword embryos were messed up by him. Of course, he gained a lot of experience. The flying sword was finally engraved to the perfection of the 5th layer. This was only the level that Sima Wan reached a year ago. This was his first flying sword, named 4 Seasons. The maximum range of 4 Seasons was no more than 350 feet. This was not only because of the few sword formations engraved, but also because of his cultivation level. The more sword formations engraved on the flying sword, the higher its ability in different directions. For example, engraving a speed sword formation would increase the flying sword's speed. Engraving a penetration sword formation would increase the power. Engraving a control sword formation would increase the flying sword's agility. Engraving an attribute sword formation would strengthen a certain attribute. Lu Xiaoyi was now researching the use of sword formations in the flying sword's attack and finding the most suitable modification for himself. Through improper practice and the basic knowledge of external swords in the Boa Tower, he roughly had a preliminary understanding of the external sword system, which was limited to the foundation establishment stage. This allowed him to understand the level of his own flying sword and the power of other people's flying swords. For a cultivator, knowing oneself and the enemy was the key. Hot-bloodedness alone could not solve any problems. His conclusion was that for a foundation establishment cultivator, purity was the key. For example, for a pure speed-type flying sword, a classic 9-layer speed-type flying sword, its basic sword formation combination was 5 or 6 layers of speed sword formation, 1 or 2 layers of control sword formation, 1 or 2 layers of strength sword formation or attribute sword formation. A flying sword refined in this way could maximize its speed advantage after ensuring a certain degree of control and penetration. This was an important direction in battle. Another example would be the 8th layer of the Eye-Soul sword formation, which was the 5th or 6th layer of the Eye-Soul sword formation, the 1st and 2nd layer of the Control sword formation, and the 1st and 2nd layer of the Speed sword formation. Its direction was to maximize the power of the Eye-Soul while ensuring the basic control and speed. The flying swords of foundation establishment cultivators would absolutely not have the 5 elements engender each other. For example, if you carved an ice formation and then a fire formation on the next layer, the only result would be mutual cancellation. There would be no engendering each other, only mutual suppression. The Tao of the 5 elements was the fundamental Tao. For foundation establishment cultivators, they might not even be able to fully understand a single element, let alone freely switch between the 5 elements. This was an ability that only cultivators at the Yuanying level and above could possess. Once he understood this, he understood why the 4 Seasons sword song was trash. Trash was trash. Using something that a foundation establishment cultivator would never be able to grasp to set up a formation. It was too difficult for a foundation establishment swordsman, but too easy for a Yuanying cultivator. The only reason Lu Shui chose this thing was because it was cheap. On this point, he had achieved his goal. It wasn't all bad news. The good news was that although his flying sword's maximum range was much shorter than other people's, it was completely controllable. This wasn't the power of the sword formation, but the effect of his powerful mental strength. To sum up his achievements in the past 2 years in one sentence, other than swordsmanship, he had made rapid progress in all other aspects. In terms of swordsmanship, he couldn't see any hope of solving this problem. He could follow the path that everyone else was on. However, he would never be able to shake off most people on this path. On the contrary, because of resources, because of hobbies, because of various practical reasons, he could only follow behind others and eat sh*t. Just like flying swords. Now that he had a year's worth of savings, he could be like his companions and buy a good sword embryo, choose a good set of swordsmanship, and walk the same path that others had walked 2 years ago. Did he want his future to be like this? Women were afraid of marrying the wrong man, and men were afraid of entering the wrong profession. If he was in a Dharma cultivation sect, he wouldn't be in this predicament, because this was what he yearned for. Yearning gave him motivation, joy, and sublimation in joy. He would be like other Dharma cultivators, eagerly absorbing all the knowledge he could learn, and following the paths of his predecessors to pursue his own path of Dharma cultivation. Because he knew nothing about Dharma veins. But now, he was in the sword vein. This was a sect that he loathed from the bottom of his heart. Because of this loathing, he didn't care about it, so he couldn't get used to it, and wanted to change reality. This was especially so when he still had an instinctive intuition about the sword vein. It was very contradictory. If he had an instinctive intuition about the sword vein, then this should be the direction of his cultivation for the rest of his life. But why was he so dismissive of the sword vein? Why did he have a soft spot for Dharma veins? He knew that he couldn't let this situation continue to develop. If he always tried both ways, the end result would be that he didn't rely on either side, and nothing would be accomplished. Since he couldn't leave Xianyuan, he should treat the sword vein as his only Dharma cultivation. Like others, he should focus on practicing the sword well, and think about other things. He set this time as 3 years, which was also within his novice protection period. Now that 2 years had passed, he still had 1 year to find a suitable path for himself. It had to be said that his subconscious had a great influence on him. It was so great that even though he knew that he might be wrong and was wasting precious time, he was still willing to set aside another year for himself. Delaying 3 years was nothing, right? His cultivation level hadn't lagged behind, and he had made remarkable progress in other areas. Perhaps he could make up for his shortcomings in swordsmanship in other areas? The lifespan of a foundation establishment cultivator was around 200 years, which meant that he still had close to 200 years. What was the rush? In this last year, he had made a lot of substantial progress. The Big Dipper constellation scripture. After continuously using the Big Dipper constellation to attract spiritual energy, he had successfully added an 8th star to the Big Dipper system. An unknown star. This was the beginning of a breakthrough. It meant that he would have more and more connections with the stars in the universe, and his cultivation speed would become faster and faster. It also meant that all the star techniques on this foundation would be improved, including the speed of the starlight attraction, the physical training of the purple star body, and more stars to provide him with the contrast of the stars to train his mind. However, his progress in the flying sword technique was very slow. Other than the increase in his cultivation level, which allowed the flying sword to fly faster, further, and more powerful, there was no improvement in the ability of the flying sword itself. This was the limitation of the outer sword. If the flying sword didn't increase the level of the sword array, it would be very difficult to unleash more power. This was also the biggest flaw in Lu Xiaoyi's subconscious mind. A swordsmanship couldn't be improved through hard work, but he had to spend most of his energy on inscribing sword arrays. He couldn't accept it. However, in the eyes of other swordsmen, this was a normal swordsman's line of work. Others regarded inscribing sword arrays as a part of swordsmanship, but he excluded inscribing sword arrays from swordsmanship. This was the source of his distress. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.